fate knocking at the door. V for victory. The most famous sequence of notes in the whole of music, from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. In this series, we'll discover how the symphony emerged from the world of aristocratic privilege, how it accompanied the rise of nations and the fall of empires, how it became a symbol of freedom and a tool of totalitarianism, how the symphony taught the orchestra how to speak, and how it established itself as the ultimate expression of the composer as an artist. It's an epic journey that takes us from small bands of musicians playing in the palaces of princes to orchestras of well over 100 performing in vast concert halls. But how ultimately, alongside these public statements, it became the vehicle for the most profound expression of private thoughts and emotions that we, the audience, can understand and relate to today. Above all, it's the story of great composers. In this first episode, we'll meet Ludwig van Beethoven, the epitome of the great composer, the artist as hero.
I think he felt that he had an heroic capacity as a creator to take music to a place that nobody thought it could ever go.
Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the genius who wrote his first symphony at the age of 8. And Joseph Haydn, the giant of 18th century music, who was dubbed the father of the symphony. It's New Year's Day 1791. The Austrian composer Joseph Haydn, 58 years old, in rude health, is sailing from Calais to Dover. It's a voyage that will take a full 10 hours. He'd left home a month earlier. This is his first trip beyond the borders of his home in a small corner of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire, leaving the security of 3 decades of service as a court musician for the aristocratic Esterházy family. He's jolted over 800 miles in a horse-drawn coach. Bad weather, bad roads, probably bad food. And across Europe, the rumblings from the aftermath of the French Revolution are still being heard. Haydn was, as ever, pragmatic, but he was also very excited. I remained on deck, he said, so as to gaze my fill of that mighty monster, the ocean. Then when the highest waves were whipped up by the wind, I became a little frightened. But I overcame it all and arrived on shore without, excuse me, vomiting. He's come with a large trunk of scores, but unfortunately, during the chaos of the luggage transfer, he's lost one vital symphonic manuscript. But this epic journey was nearly over. In just 2 days' time, he'd be welcomed into London. More than welcomed. He'd be received as the first ever bona fide musical superstar. His first 6 months will be non-stop, contracted to deliver 6 symphonies and already missing 1 score. But Haydn is no ordinary composer. He is the most extraordinary of ordinary men. And here he is, Joseph Haydn, painted in the year of his arrival in England in 1791 by the society portraitist John Hopner on the orders of King George III himself. It's a sign of the man's celebrity. Haydn came from a humble background, but here he holds himself with immense self-assurance. And is there the sharp light of curiosity in his eyes? Haydn was always enthusiastic about exploring the world around him. Today, his name is associated above all with the symphony, the form which he, more than anybody else in the 18th century, worked to develop. In his hands, the symphony became what the dictionary now defines it as, a large-scale work, usually in 4 sections or movements, and regarded as the most exalted form a composer can use. And his London symphonies were to bring the works of his genius to the widest possible audience.
Haydn had this capacity to write music that would speak immediately to all hearers. What comes out more than anything else is a sense of a new sound world.
London was the most prosperous and fastest growing city in the world. By the 1790s, the fashion for opera that had dominated upper class taste for most of the 18th century was now on the wane, and the new middle class, who felt that they'd earned their wealth rather than inherited it, was keen for something new that would reflect their sense of themselves as discerning and cultured.
Haydn was intensely interested in all aspects of British life. He visited palaces and naval dockyards. He was horrified by the levels of public drunkenness that he witnessed, and he kept detailed notes about the people that he met and the music that they listened to. He stayed with one short interval for 4 years. The invitation had come from the violinist, composer and concert organizer Johann Peter Salomon, a German by birth and a man known to be highly efficient in business matters.
Salomon had assembled the finest musicians in the city and hired a recently opened elegant concert hall on the corner of Hanover Square in fashionable Mayfair. The series of concerts the two men would now promote here, with Haydn as composer and Salomon as orchestral leader, would position the symphony at the centre of London's rapidly growing social and cultural life.
This site occupies the exact footprint of the Hanover Square rooms when Haydn first saw them in 1791.
Salomon had taken a canny commercial gamble with this concert season, but it would more than pay off.
All the modish world appear fond of nothing else, my dear. Folks of fashion eager seek 16 concerts in a week. And this is the kind of orchestra that you might have found in the Hanover rooms in the early 1790s. And this combination and arrangement of instruments established a blueprint for the symphonic repertoire for the next 100 years or so. At the back, we have the woodwind, the brass, the percussion sections. They were raised on a platform, which was a novelty in Haydn's time, no doubt enhanced the visual excitement of the concert, as well as helped with the balance of sound. In front, we have the string section, double basses, cellos, violas, violins, who were divided into 2 sections, the seconds and the firsts. In the front sat the leader, who on this occasion is Maggie, but for many of Haydn's concerts would have been Salomon himself. And in the centre was Haydn, the composer, leading the operation, but not exactly conducting in the way that we might understand it today.
These symphonies were designed to be shared by the audience and the players together.
And to be seen.
To be seen. The drama inherent in how will Mr. Haydn treat his orchestra in this one? What surprises are we going to get?
Symphony number 98 is one of the greatest London symphonies. Actually written in England to replace the one he'd lost crossing the Channel, it contains a typical Haydn surprise.
His take on the British national anthem. In the second of 4 movements, he takes this tune, varies it, transforms it, and this is the key to the symphony in Haydn's hands. He takes a musical idea on a journey, and through the course of that journey, everything changes. Haydn's sense of playing around is very evident in the 98th Symphony, isn't it?
Oh, yes. And he knew how to respond to the occasion, too, didn't he? And his music produced such incredible reactions of joy and delight and surprise. It's difficult to imagine nowadays, isn't it? The way audiences always behave very po-faced and quiet, and anybody who coughs is criticized. If you liked something in a Haydn symphony, everybody exclaimed and clapped.
Haydn and Salomon's symphony concerts were an unprecedented success, but it wasn't long before the composer needed some time to himself.
And this house, deep in the Lee Valley in Hertfordshire, was where he stayed for the summer of 1791.
Of all the places Haydn lived and worked during his 4-year stay, this one, Roxford, is the only survivor, and it was here that he composed Symphony 98.
It was a retreat from the social world that he was very much caught up in London to a sort of countryside life that he would have been familiar with from Austria, back to a place where he could think about people he'd met, he could think about musical interests of people, and he could write the kind of compositions that they were interested in.
I work industriously, he wrote to a friend, and then added with a touch of homesickness, early every morning when I walk alone in the wood with my English grammar, I think of my creator and of my family and friends left behind.
Despite his homesickness, the last movement of Symphony 98 is full of playfulness and joy, with a whole series of startling ideas and effects.
The last movement is very fast and lively. Presto, it's marked, which is as fast as you can get. It's like a motor rhythm that never wants to stop. It powers its way forward, and it's just when you're expecting a repeat of the theme, because you've already heard it, he then takes you by surprise, and they start again with the theme a bit slower. But he's got the ace up his sleeve. He makes himself play on the fortepiano. A little, very trivial, little sort of inner voice as the violins play the tune for the last time. And it's so lovely that it would have delighted the audience. You can imagine, oh, tonight, you know, the great Dr. Haydn gave us a little virtuoso display on the fortepiano.
You almost don't hear it at first, do you? You can think, oh my gosh.
Yes, it's like it's inside, isn't it? It's the sort of hemoglobin of the music, just keeping the whole thing alive.
So where did Haydn's genius spring from? Indeed, where did the symphony itself come from? I'm going to travel back in time to Haydn's early life and career in rural Austria. A journey that will allow us to understand the development of the symphony in the 18th century.
He was born not far from the Hungarian border in the spring of 1732, the second eldest of 17 children. His father was a wheelwright, and both his parents sang for pleasure. Sent to a local school, he learned to read and write and to sing. They taught me so much, he said, although I received more thrashings than food. Then one day, the school was visited by the choir master from Vienna's main cathedral, St. Stephen's, and 8-year-old Joseph was auditioned.
So the small, talented boy from the provinces joined the mighty Stephansdom choir in Vienna. We can picture him, an undistinguished-looking little fellow, even at the age of 9, wearing a wig. When his voice begins to break, the priest suggests castrating him in order to preserve his beautiful treble. But luckily for little Joseph, his father intervenes. Finally, he's dishonorably discharged from the choir after an incident which sees him cutting off another boy's pigtail. For the next few years, he struggles, hungry to the point of starvation and tormented by the affluent city life he sees around him.
Joseph Haydn's life was saved by his talent. Once his first compositions began to be played around Vienna's salons and beer gardens, it didn't take long for him to be singled out as someone special, and by the time he was 25, his hungry years were over.
In the 18th century, artists generally were employed by the church, a royal court, or a member of the aristocracy. No king, prince, or nobleman worth his salt was without his house band, and Haydn was fortunate in that he was asked to work for one of the most noble and wealthiest families in Europe, the Esterházys.
The family palace was in the remote location of Eisenstadt in eastern Austria, but having his own orchestra gave Haydn exactly what he needed. As well as being able to fulfill all the normal duties of a composer, such as church music and opera, he was able to experiment with new instrumental forms. He arrived in 1761, just as Nicholas I inherited the Esterházy title. The new prince was rich, extravagant, and crucially, his palace had a particularly fine music room.
So here it is, the crucible of Haydn's laboratory. No, not just the crucible, the large Hadron Collider. Over 70 symphonies in 30 years. Prince Niklaus was obsessed with music, and in order to feed his voracious appetite, Haydn needed to find a form that would show off the full range and virtuosity of the prince's orchestra.
At the beginning, there were only a tiny group of musicians, no more than 14 of them, and yet Haydn was inspired by both the quality of their playing and the beauty of the music room to produce extraordinary symphonies. One of the first is Le Matin, Morning.
It starts with a sunrise that in its detailed, tiny way is a little masterpiece in its own right. In the course of this little masterpiece, various members of this little ensemble get moments of glory.
It wasn't just the size of Haydn's house band that was so different from a modern symphony orchestra, it was the instruments as well. The early brass and woodwind were primitive and hard to play, but Haydn's solo writing demonstrates that he could count on some real virtuosity from his players. Before Haydn, the symphony certainly existed, but what precisely was it? The word symphony literally means sounding together, making music. And its earliest use was to distinguish between vocal church music, the sound of angels perhaps, and the music that instrumentalists might play by themselves as their contribution to a church service. Earthly music, music that grounds us in the world of the here and now, before the choir claims our souls, imaginations, and our ears for God. Haydn wrote symphonies on demand for a variety of occasions. One of his greatest early Eisenstadt works is a church symphony, number 22, written to be performed during Mass. It later acquired the nickname of the Philosopher, possibly because its first movement is exceptionally solemn, demonstrating the emotional depths of which the symphony was going to be capable in Haydn's hands.
The form of early symphonies also came from the opera house originally, when the instrumental movements at the beginning of an evening constituted a suite, not designed to be an artistic whole, but a way to lead the audience into the entertainment. Now, from those beginnings, Haydn realized that he could extend the contrasts into making a four-movement package. Very often, this could be fast. Then a long, slow movement. That gave a sense of gravitas to the whole event. Then a dancing minuet to sort of clear the air, and then a final fast movement.
The Esterházy Palace in Eisenstadt truly was Haydn's laboratory. The symphony, as he developed it, draws from a combination of church music, the world of opera, and having talented musicians to write for. With all these factors in place, he was able to perfect the four-movement symphony.
But beyond that, he experimented with other elements. The unexpected juxtaposition of mood, unusual instrumentation, theatrical effects, surprises, jokes. The symphony became a finely wrought interplay of forces, each one a unique and enthralling journey.
As a symphonist, Haydn is in many ways like a master chef who combines different ingredients to create new dishes. In his kitchen garden in Eisenstadt, he planted out his own selection of herbs, and here I met Sigrid Weiss, who is an expert on Baroque cookery.
How lovely to meet you. This is gorgeous.
I'll walk you around a little.
So what do we have here?
Here we have thyme, two different sorts.
The lean and hungry years of his youth gave Haydn an obsession with food. In his letters, he's always either praising or complaining about his diet.
They like to use these strong-smelling herbs on the meat in the Baroque, because of course they had no refrigerator, so the meat was not always as fresh.
Mint here.
Haydn the gardener and Haydn the gourmet are all part of the complete picture of Haydn the master craftsman.
And this one,
Roman sorrel.
could we eat it?
We could liken the symphonic development in one of Haydn's opening movements to the preparation of a carefully balanced meal of the sort which the composer often enjoyed.
Whoa. Oh, it's lovely.
It's like lemon.
All the themes are gathered together at the beginning of the piece in the same way one might gather and prepare ingredients, then cook a simple starter. This is what's called the exposition, a tasty first course that whets your appetite for what's to come.
Thank you very much. Well, guten Appetit.
The next stage, the development, blends together, reshapes and cooks up all these ingredients, allowing new flavours to emerge. Finally, in the recapitulation, all the themes and harmonies are brought together and resolved, just like the finished main course. This is one of Haydn's particular favourites, braised rabbit with dumplings and cherries.
Fantastic.
That was totally delicious.
In the 1760s, Prince Nicholas decided to build an elaborate new pleasure palace 50 kilometres east from Eisenstadt, over the Hungarian border. So every summer, the entire court, including Haydn and his orchestra, decamped to the fairy tale palace of Esterházy. However, although there were music rooms, ballrooms, banqueting pavilions and a full-scale opera house, there was only very limited accommodation for the many musicians. Families had to stay in Eisenstadt. No wives, no girlfriends, no families. The musicians were understandably miserable. But Haydn came up with his own rather witty version of industrial action. Symphony 45 was one of the 36 symphonies written for the summer festivities at Esterházy. It's a serious, sometimes stormy work, but at the end comes Haydn's protest, a gesture that gives the work its familiar nickname, the farewell. As the last restless movement comes to a close, the music suddenly slows down and the players begin to leave the stage, one by one, each snuffing out the candle on his music stand as he goes. Finally, there are just two violins left playing, pianissimo, and the music evaporates into silence. The prince took the hint. The following day, the court returned home to the domestic comforts of Eisenstadt.
Haydn was to stay in Esterházy for nearly 30 years, but this was very unusual. Most composers of the time led a much more nomadic existence, moving from place to place, and this is, of course, how musical ideas were moved around. One of these travelling musicians was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and in 1764, not long after Haydn arrived in Eisenstadt, he visited London. Mozart spent a large part of his childhood on an interminable tour of Europe, accompanied by his father and his older sister. The family arrived here in London and moved into lodgings above a barber shop, which now, delightfully, is an antiquarian bookseller's specialising in music. The whole thing must have been a bit of an ordeal. There were reports of all three of them being ill at one time or another. But it did produce at least one unexpected benefit. Whilst his father was bedridden, the 8-year-old Wolfgang decided to write his first symphony. Now remember, he was 8. This symphony has been criticised as being derivative, and some have said that it was written by his father, and I'm sure his father helped him a great deal. But the important point, surely, is that it's a symphony written by an 8-year-old, and it's structurally perfect, exquisitely balanced, and very, very nice to listen to. In his teens, Mozart crisscrossed Europe, picking up ideas wherever he went. One of the key centres was Mannheim in southwest Germany, where the court orchestra was a finely tuned virtuoso ensemble. The court composer was Johann Stamitz, who wrote 60 prototype symphonies for them. They became well known for their novel, dynamic effects. An opening coup d'archet, a loud bang at the beginning of a piece of music that would wake the audience up and grab their attention. The Mannheim rocket, a cluster of notes that soared thrillingly heavenwards, and a big orchestral crescendo that was so unexpected that apparently ladies in the audience used to faint with excitement. In preparing the music with the orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, Mark Elder was keen to work on some of the effects achieved by these symphonic pioneers.
Obviously, what we've got to try and show in this very exciting music is the style, and they were specialists in a sort of bravura attack. Here it is. And the coup d'archet was the way everybody attacked the bow in the same way, and as they all did that. Can we just try that once again? The idea of getting louder from playing very soft and going to very loud is something we're all so familiar with. We do it all the time. But the idea that this was a new way of musicians together expressing the same energy and the same emotion gave the music a new excitement and a new daring.
So celebrated did Mannheim become that in 1777, the 22-year-old Wolfgang Mozart visited the orchestra, bringing with him the score of his latest symphony.
when Mozart decided to premiere this symphony, his 31st, with them in this very room, he was test driving his work, which included several of the crowd-pleasing Mannheim special effects. At this stage in his life, Mozart really needed a success. In Paris, there were many wealthy, sophisticated music lovers, and his carefully crafted symphony might land him a commission or even a job. Paris in the middle of the 18th century was very different from the modern city. The Eiffel Tower and the famous boulevard weren't, of course, built until the 19th century. And in 1778, when Mozart arrived, the area around here was dominated by a vast Renaissance palace, the Tuileries, where the fashionable and cultured aristocracy, this was before the revolution, remember, flocked to hear music. Mozart's symphony, later to become known as the Paris Symphony, was first heard here in June 1778. Every detail was honed to accord with contemporary Parisian taste. In the middle of the first movement is a section I knew would excite them, he later wrote to his father, and sure enough, the audience was carried away by it. Since I knew when I wrote it that it would have this sort of effect, I used it again at the end. The symphony was a mild success. Perhaps he had so conformed to local tastes that the work didn't particularly stand out. After the concert, he wrote, "I was happy, so as soon as the concert was over, I rushed over to the Palais Royal, ordered myself a large ice cream, said my rosary, and went home." Mozart wasn't the only symphonist keen to conquer the discerning audiences of Paris. 5 years later, half a dozen new symphonies by Joseph Haydn arrived to great acclaim. Although Prince Esterhazy didn't allow his composer to travel, he was happy for Haydn's scores to spread his fame. And when Mozart, now living in Vienna, heard these Paris symphonies, they were to inspire his final great symphonic outpouring. In 1788, a year before revolution convulsed France and indeed Europe, Mozart performed here in this Viennese cafe, but perhaps more significantly, he also wrote 3 symphonies in a matter of weeks. The noble number 39, the dark turbulent number 40, unusually in a minor key, and the extrovert number 41, later nicknamed the Jupiter, a piece of almost extravagant technical virtuosity. Mozart's final years are something of a mystery. We have lots of small details, how frequently he changed apartment, for instance. But about the bigger picture, there's nothing at all. What he thought about the music he was writing, his ambitions, his hopes and his fears. And about the last few symphonies, no information. These symphonies were completed 3 years before his sudden, tragic, early death. But we have no idea what occasioned them, and there is no record of them ever having been actually performed in his lifetime.
These last symphonies are emotionally rich and full of sadness, just when you least expect it. The palette of emotional intensity is very, very marked. And one feels that, whether or not he could have written many more symphonies, that these were a summation for him of what he could achieve in the form. And each of them has such a different character. Now, to me, the character comes from the choice of key. And we know before he wrote them, that he received a new score of 3 of Haydn's symphonies, and that they were in these same 3 keys, E flat, G minor, and C major, which were the keys of Mozart's last 3 symphonies. He was inspired and wanted to give something to the form that he hadn't hitherto managed.
Mozart clearly admired the symphonic innovations that Haydn had discovered in his laboratory in Eisenstadt, and when the two composers met for the first time in the late 1780s, Haydn repaid the compliment. "Some have said that I might have some genius," he remarked, "but Mozart is always my superior."
Suddenly, in 1790, everything changed. Prince Nikolaus died unexpectedly, and the next prince, his son Anton, immediately began to dismantle his father's extravagant and expensive musical establishment. Despite a generous pension, Haydn must have wondered what the future would bring. And then one night, as he was sitting at home, there was a loud knock on the front door. A stranger was let in and declared boldly, "I am Salomon of London, and I have come to fetch you." It was a decisive moment in Haydn's life and in the history of the symphony. Just before setting off on his epic journey, Haydn joined Salomon and Mozart for a farewell meal. Salomon was keen to sign Wolfgang up for a British tour, but the young composer seemed more concerned about his colleagues' welfare. "You're not young anymore," he said. "But I'm still in good health," Haydn replied. "You're too unworldly and speak too few languages," Mozart said. "No," Haydn replied firmly. "My language is understood all over the world." And now we're back where we started in the last decade of the 18th century with Haydn's triumphal arrival in London. After 30 years as a sort of musical servant in Austria, he's welcomed here as the greatest composer of his age. As the Sun newspaper of 1794 put it, his music is exquisite, rich, fanciful, bold, and impressive. London gave Joseph Haydn a new lease of life. 4 years of wildly successful concerts, 12 new symphonies premiered, the last in 1795 here at the Theatre Royal Music Rooms in the Haymarket. As one enamoured critic gushed, would Haydn ever get to the bottom of his genius box? Well, the answer to that surely must be no. Although he would write over 100 symphonies over the course of a long working life, Haydn himself would have recognised neither the dizzying upward spiral of numbers from his first symphony in D major, written in 1759, to his 104th, written some 40 years later, nor the affectionate nicknames that some of the pieces acquired: the philosopher, the farewell, the surprise, the military. For the first time in his life, Haydn had escaped the aristocratic bubble of Eisenstadt. The London symphonies reflect both his new experiences of the world and his encounters with a wider audience.
In London, there was hunger for music that spoke to the tensions around the French Revolution and the anxieties that the British had when revolution turned into attack on other countries.
Now symphonies were not only being played in public, but becoming public statements in themselves. The Military Symphony, the eighth of the London Symphonies, written in 1794, and a masterpiece. It was Haydn's greatest success during his visit to England. It's war music that the audience regarded as acutely topical. It's difficult with our modern ears to grasp the impact this work had on the British public. Amongst other things, Haydn shocked them with his use for the first time of Turkish percussion. Encore, encore, encore resounded from every seat. The ladies themselves could not forbear. It is the advance into battle and the march of men. The sounding of the charge, the thundering of the onset. Clash of arms, the groans of the wounded, and what may be called the hellish roar of war increases to a climax of horrid sublimity.
Haydn, writing for London audiences in the 1790s, was very much aware that they saw themselves as a manly military society, and Haydn absolutely captured that.
When Haydn left London to return home to Austria, he made a brief stop along the way in the provincial German town of Bonn. Here he was to meet for the first time the composer who would carry the symphony forward into the next century, Ludwig van Beethoven.
Haydn was 60 and the sullen young viola player, he was a member of the Elector of Bonn's orchestra, was 22. He was already showing some promise as a composer. He'd written 2 attention-grabbing imperial cantatas, and Haydn agreed to take him on as a student.
It was never an easy relationship. You will have thoughts that no one has had before, said Haydn, but the rules will always be sacrificed to your moods. England had changed Haydn. Mozart had died whilst he was away, and he returned to Austria an old man. Papa Haydn, they now started calling him. He left behind him the court at Esterhazy and came to Vienna to take up his rightful place as a senior member of Viennese society. And significantly, he stopped writing symphonies, but he had by no means retired. Before he left London, Salomon had given him a manuscript, an anonymous libretto in English, based partly on the book of Genesis and partly on Milton's poem, Paradise Lost. The result was The Creation, a large, complex, elegant work that brought together the very best of Haydn's symphonic technique with his love of writing for voices. It was to prove both popular and influential. This vast, ambitious, cosmic work, although not itself a symphony, opens up a myriad of possibilities for orchestral music. On the threshold of the new century, Haydn demonstrated that music could be more than entertainment at a polite social gathering, and become a profound and thought-provoking dramatic experience for its audience. The last performance Haydn attended was here, in a room at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, on March the 27th, 1808, a year before he died. It was his 76th birthday, and the aged and ill composer was brought in to loud acclamation. His former pupil Beethoven was also here and apparently wept during the performance. At the point early on in the piece when God creates light, the audience burst out into spontaneous applause, but Haydn, in response, indicated upwards, as if to say, "Not from me, everything comes from up there."
He became known as the father of the symphony, i.e. not necessarily the first, but the person who gave us so many great symphonies that he managed to explore the potential of the symphonic orchestra of his day. And that would take the idea of what a symphony could be further and further along the path.
Haydn, over the course of a long 40-year career, turned out over 100. Mozart, in his short life, wrote about 40. Ludwig van Beethoven wrote only 9, but each symphony redrew the musical landscape and threw down a challenge that no future symphonist could possibly ignore. In 1800, as Europe stood on the threshold of a new century, the Viennese public were treated to the premiere of a new work, Beethoven's First Symphony in C major, which, much to their surprise, began with a discord. At this point, the symphony was seen primarily as a means of entertainment, not as the vehicle for the exploration of political, social, and moral ideas. In 1790, the philosopher Kant dismissed instrumental music as more pleasure than culture. His grounds for this remark were the fact that music couldn't incorporate concepts. Any ideas it might seem to generate were, in his words, accidents.
If you say to me, sum up what makes Beethoven different in one sentence, he broke the rules. This is pure Beethoven, but it is a youthful Beethoven. But having said that, he did not complete his first symphony until he was 29 years of age. Now, in prodigy terms, that's middle-aged. Haydn and Mozart had knocked off loads of symphonies by the time they were 29. Why did Beethoven wait so long? Because he was aware of the legacy of the likes of Mozart and Haydn.
If the first symphony represents a noble and steady start, then the second is a sudden wrench forwards into the future. Premiered in the year that Britain declared war on France, it has at its heart the 31-year-old Beethoven's first major symphonic innovation. He replaces the old-fashioned aristocratic dance movement, the minuet, with a scherzo, which literally means joke, an energetic and sometimes confrontational movement that captures the speed and violence of early 19th century urban life. This is a joke which, repeated often enough, begins to sound like a threat. It is a crude monster like a wounded dragon that refuses to die, writhing and bleeding, lashing out furiously with its tail. The summer of 1802 he spends in a rural village north of Vienna called Heiligenstadt. He's composing his second symphony, but as he works, he becomes more and more aware that his hearing is starting to fail. Heiligenstadt was for Beethoven a place of despair. Dissatisfied with many things, he wrote, more susceptible than any other person, and tormented by my deafness, I find only suffering in the company of others.
He's acknowledged to himself he's deaf. And the great miracle of art is that the moment he's acknowledged it, we enter what's cornerly called the heroic period. We get the great, great works of art because he's overcome it.
To tell the next part of the story, we need to return to Paris and to a hero's grave. Just as Beethoven defined his era in music, so Napoleon Bonaparte towered over his era in world politics, although of course he himself was quite a small man. The name of Napoleon was so potent, his military prowess was so fearsome, that he dominated and terrorized Europe for over a dozen years. After his successful coup d'etat in 1799, he appointed himself first consul, a man of the French people devoted to restoring the republican virtues of liberty, equality and fraternity after a decade of gross mismanagement and institutionalized terror so widespread that the guillotine earned the nickname the National Razor. Beethoven had found the subject for his third and most radical symphony yet, a work so massive that its first movement alone is as long as many of Haydn's early symphonies. Eroica, the heroic symphony.
The Eroica is an extraordinary, huge advance on anything anyone had done before.
He was a man of the people, creating art for the people, and he thought that was what Napoleon represented.
The Eroica comes to stand for what symphonic composers want to achieve through their musical works.
The Eroica was a revolutionary piece of work, and Beethoven needed new techniques if he was to express adequately his thoughts about Napoleon, a man who was effecting such rapid and sweeping changes across Europe, a man who many believed would bring peace, security and liberty to a troubled continent. There was no way that Europe could possibly return to life as it was in the days before 1789, and there was no looking back to old models for Beethoven. The new work just had to be radical, its first performance explosive. And this is the room where it all happened. Beethoven's friend, Ferdinand Ries, said the composer wrote his symphony with Napoleon Bonaparte in mind, but Napoleon as first consul. He held him in great esteem and compared him to the greatest consuls of ancient Rome. Ferdinand Ries himself saw a beautifully copied manuscript of the symphony lying on Beethoven's table, and on the front page were inscribed the names Napoleon at the top and Beethoven at the bottom. But when Beethoven was told that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, he flew into a rage and screamed, "So now he is no more than a common mortal. Now he will tread on all the rights of man, indulge only his ambition, think himself superior to all men, become a tyrant." And he went over to the table, picked up the manuscript, ripped the front page in half and threw it on the floor. Napoleon I, Emperor of the French, still had 16 more years to live, but for Beethoven it was clear his greatness had died on the day of his coronation. The second movement of the Eroica is a funeral march, perhaps mourning the loss of a hero. When the symphony was published 3 years later, it bore an inscription to celebrate the memory of a great man. Beethoven lived in more than 60 different places during his 35 years in Vienna. I joined musicologist Professor John Dethridge to visit this one, which is typically cramped and out of the way. But wherever the composer lodged, there were always two inevitable objects, a piano and a treasured portrait. John, this is a picture of Beethoven at about the time he wrote his Third Symphony in the Eroica, is that right?
That's correct. Painted by a friend of his called Willibord Mehler. He played the last movement to the painter, and then he continued on improvising for 2 hours. What Mehler was interested in was capturing something of the mythological side of the Eroica.
And this rather awkward stance.
Yes, a little bit like the Mona Lisa in a sort of country landscape, and the eyes are looking askance. And I often think that this hand here, it's a very strong hand, has something to do with his impression of Beethoven playing the last movement of the Eroica. It was clearly a very important painting for Beethoven because he took it with him everywhere.
Why did he like it? I'm tempted to say vanity, because he looks rather good in this.
It represents for him, I think, something very important about his role as a symphonic composer. I am here in the world as a composer, and this is what my symphonies are going to be.
I feel that the Third Symphony is like on the threshold of another age. It's written because he wanted to answer what he felt was the scale of Napoleon's achievements, and the normal symphony wouldn't have been enough.
Do you think he saw himself as a hero?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I feel sure that he knew he had the capacity in him that was given to very few other creators, and that he owed it to himself to find the extent of the depth of his talent, which is why he kept pushing the boundaries further and further to create more emotional truth. I think he felt that he had an heroic capacity as a creator to take music to a place that nobody thought it could ever go.
And he would not stop here. There were 6 more symphonies still to come. His encroaching deafness would strengthen his almost heroic willpower and give his music a sense of profound, universal compassion. After the Eroica, anything was possible, and the symphony took its place as music's most expressive and articulate form. To go deeper into the music and unravel the secrets of the symphony, follow the links to the Open University at bbc.co.uk/symphony. Europe at the beginning of the 19th century, a continent at war with itself. The symphony is revolutionized, changed beyond all recognition in the space of just 30 years by 2 titanic men, one German and one French. The music and ideas of Beethoven and Berlioz were profoundly influenced by the French Revolution and its aftermath. And their symphonies would offer audiences a new understanding of the world in a time of great change and anxiety.
Beethoven was a revolutionary and idealist, Berlioz an iconoclast and visionary, and both men had personalities almost too big for the world that they inhabited.
Ludwig van Beethoven, the German who struggled with his deafness, but whose 9 symphonies are one of the great wonders of human achievement.
Beethoven was after something epic. The idea that an orchestra could portray a journey from darkness into the blaze of what one might call victory. Now, this was completely original. Nobody had dared to do something as modern as this.
Hector Berlioz, the French composer who came after him, driven by obsession to give the symphony his own wild and romantic voice.
Berlioz was a bit of a maverick. It's quite extraordinary, the use of the orchestra. He seems to think of it as an instrument in itself, I think, as a virtuoso instrument.
We'll see how composers became artists determined to control their own destinies, how they gave orchestral music without words great stories to tell, and how composers as different as Liszt and Schubert were inspired to take this symphony to new and undreamt of places after Beethoven's death. Our story starts in the imperial Austrian city of Vienna, where 200 years ago an extraordinary concert would change the course of music.
It was here at the Theater an der Wien just before Christmas 1808 that the curtain was raised.
This was the 38-year-old Ludwig van Beethoven's declaration of his status as an independent artist in control of his own destiny. He was the composer, conductor, piano soloist, and the concert promoter, and this performance would last 4 hours. It was an evening that featured not just one new symphony, but 2, each as different from the other as they were from any music that had preceded them. It was during this mammoth concert, it really does take your breath away. There were half a dozen other pieces by Beethoven on the programme, both old and new, that the 5th and the 6th symphony were heard for the first time. The most famous 4-note sequence in music, instantly recognisable to us today as Beethoven's 5th, and full of associations. Fate knocking at the door, V for victory. But how must it have sounded to that original audience? Beethoven presented it as pure music, no clue to its significance or meaning.
Well, Beethoven as a personality was so tricky and so uncouth in so many ways, and had such a difficult, troubled childhood, that the adult that gave us some of these pieces was a man so often at odds with the world around him.
Born in poverty in the German town of Bonn, he was bullied as a child by his alcoholic father, and in his 20s realised he was going deaf, surely the cruelest of tragedies for a musician. But Beethoven was a man with a will of iron, and in the 5th he harnesses the power of the orchestra to an insistent, propulsive rhythm, forcing the symphony to articulate the profoundest personal drama. The story of a soul struggling against implacable fate and emerging incandescently victorious.
One of the great contrasts available to a composer are the contrasts of darkness and lightness. And in his 5th symphony, builds up from hesitant darkness into the radiant blaze of optimism, confidence, whatever. Now, he does this through the simplest of means. At the end of the 3rd movement, which is the rather shadowy, dark scherzo, his plan is to burst us into the light without stopping. Now he does this by making the orchestra play as quietly as it can, all the strings just plucking, very, very quietly. Then comes the heartbeat of the drum, very, very quiet and distant, and the strings just moving up and down, uncertain about which way they're going to go. And then suddenly, very quickly, the whole orchestra comes in, and without stopping, we burst into the final movement. This is in the major key. Lights full on after lights hardly on at all.
This symphony is a masterpiece of storytelling without words. When the French Revolution erupted, Beethoven was a teenager struggling to support his family after the death of their mother, and the concept of individual liberty became a lifelong issue. And we, the listeners, are compelled to share his battle against fate.
Although Beethoven wanted to write something that was comprehensible at first hearing, he wasn't writing simply to give pleasure. He wanted it to be a potentially life-changing experience, music that would resonate in the mind long after the last note had sounded.
The other symphony in that epic programme couldn't have been more different from the dramatic fifth, demonstrating the breadth of Beethoven's extraordinary vision of what the symphony could be. However, making a living as an independent professional composer was something very new, and his early concerts were invariably under-rehearsed, badly organised financial disasters. To escape his troubles, he loved to walk in the country, and in the Sixth Symphony we join him on one of his walks through his beloved Austrian countryside.
A friend said nature was almost meat and drink to him. He seemed positively to exist upon it.
But this was more than recreation. To walk in the country was a kind of political act. Beethoven was a romantic in the strictest sense. As you walked away from urban society, you became a natural being, no longer measured in terms of wealth and social status, but able to find your place as part of the natural order of things.
It's actually opening spaces for people's imagination rather than telling them what to think. And this creates a wonderful myth about the transformation, almost the redemption of the artists in the urban situation by going into the countryside that became a very influential model for composers later. So it's not really about the countryside, it's really about someone in the city thinking about the countryside and creating a myth about it.
This symphony has 5 distinct movements rather than the standard 4, and for the first and only time in a Beethoven symphony, each one had a title that was printed in the programme. This is programmatic music. The first movement is the awakening of cheerful feelings upon arrival in the country, and he called the second Scene by a Brook.
Programme headings were uncharacteristic for Beethoven, but they look forward to the literary symphonies to come. The French composer Hector Berlioz, who, as we shall see, later took up the idea of programmatic music with great élan, wrote of this second movement, Scene by a Brook. I think here the composer actually created the music whilst lying on his back on a grassy bank. His eyes turned towards heaven, he's observing and listening, enthralled by the countless reflections of sound and light as the current of the brook sends ripples across the surface of the water. This is the actual brook. Not quite so pastoral nowadays. The symphony is a sequence of encounters with nature, scene painting which stimulates thoughts and feelings, and Beethoven rarely allowed himself to be so light and charming, or so literal. This movement ends with a faithful music reproduction of birdsong.
And what's so funny about it is the birds that he chose. It says in the score here, the nightingale, and then you hear the quail. I mean, I don't know when you last heard a quail.
I haven't heard many in my life.
Normally
well,
they're...
not consciously.
And then there's a cuckoo, isn't there? A famous cuckoo. Yeah.
Do you want to play, if you play the...
Shall I do the nightingale?
Nightingale.
Struggle to play it. But it's a work of great freshness, full of humour, of dancing exhilaration, of great beauty, and a masterpiece of form.
The songs of the nightingale, quail and cuckoo gain an extra poignancy if you bear in mind the composer's growing deafness. In its own way, the Pastoral is a work just as visionary as the Fifth, offering a utopian vision of peace, harmony and fulfillment against the contemporary backdrop of war-torn Europe. When Beethoven was a young man in the late 1780s and early 1790s, he was fascinated by what was happening across the border in France. He was a member of Republican circles, and for him the notion of being an independent composer was linked to ideas of liberty and the rights of man. Once, when someone asked him whether the van in his name, Ludwig van Beethoven, denoted aristocratic origins, he snapped back, "I'm not a landowner, I'm a brain owner." After the premiere of the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies, Napoleon invades Austria and occupies Vienna. Beethoven hides in his brother's cellar, protecting his ears from the sound of French cannon by burying his head in pillows. His former teacher, the 77-year-old Joseph Haydn, is luckier. Such is Napoleon's respect for the father of the symphony that he orders guards to protect him. Haydn, a firm anti-republican, makes a point of taking up his hymn, Gott erhalte Franz den Kaiser, otherwise known as the tune of Deutschland über alles, and playing it loudly in protest every morning. Sadly, within weeks of the French invasion, Haydn is gone, dying peacefully in his sleep. Now Beethoven became Vienna's indisputable musical hero. The premiere of his Seventh Symphony in 1813 coincided with Napoleon's defeat and was hailed as a victory symphony. The following year, his Eighth won new admirers with its wit and humour. Now his concerts had become major musical events.
The audiences of Vienna were the most musically sophisticated in Europe. They knew what they had lost with Haydn and Mozart, and when another one came along, they went, "Blimey, but have you heard him?" And people would say, "Beethoven's giving a concert. Let's go, you never quite know what's going to happen."
Finally, in 1824, at the most prestigious venue in Vienna, the Kärntnertor Theatre,
Viennese audiences would hear his final and most groundbreaking symphony yet.
The Kentner Tortheater is long gone, but on its site stands one of Vienna's great and most glorious institutions, the Hotel Sacher, home to one of the world's most famous cakes, the Sacher Torte.
Right from the opening notes, where the orchestra seemed to be suspended in the cosmic vastness of space, it was clear that Beethoven's Ninth was going to be another leap forward. Trying to think how to compare the Ninth Symphony with a chocolate cake, but beyond the fact that both are rich and satisfying, I can't do it. The fact of the matter is that the Ninth Symphony is not just any old piece of music. It's a colossal achievement, a comprehensive, if unpredictable, tour through the human condition. It would be better to compare it to the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel or the Great Wall of China. In fact, it's so big, it probably can be seen from space. And it has great tunes. This is Beethoven at his most iconoclastic. He hadn't written a symphony for a dozen years, and he really was now the most celebrated composer in the world. So his devoted supporters flocked to see how he no longer just broke the rules, but barely acknowledged that they existed. The inspiration behind the Ninth Symphony was Friedrich Schiller's poem and Die Freude, the Ode to Joy, a stirring celebration of human happiness and universal brotherhood.
He first read Schiller's and Die Freude when he was a student, and he wrote a setting of it only a year or two after he first read it, so he was about 20 or 21. So the idea to set that poem had been in his mind all his adult life. Remember, Beethoven lived through the French Revolution, and there's a crucial line, alle Menschen werden Brüder, all mankind will be brothers. And that line appealed to him because Beethoven was, although he never spelled it out as such, the great democrat.
I just get this feeling there must have been a moment when he thought, I can't go any further with just instruments.
Well, he brought voices in for the first time in a symphony. He struggled over that. He could not work out a way to bring them in. And the sudden idea of the solo bass singer singing, "Oh, Freunde," which to us, again, is as natural as breathing, was about his fourth or fifth idea before he got what he wanted.
Right from the beginning, this final section of the Ninth Symphony seemed to take on an independent life of its own. There's always been a particular resonance for German speakers, and in the 1930s and 40s it was used as a propaganda tool by the Nazi Party, performed to mark such events as Hitler's birthday.
Well, it had such incredible familiarity value, didn't it? And it's one of the great things about the main tune of the symphony is that once you've heard it once, it stays with you. You could always hum along with it.
The work is about brotherhood, and the trouble with it is that it's asking you to come together in one uniform mass, which suits the kind of pictures we're seeing at the moment. You don't have to interpret it that way, however, because you can always say we need to come together because we're reacting against an authoritarian idea of normality. So the piece can be read two ways.
But the music isn't ambiguous at all, is it?
No, it's about joy.
Yeah, and energy, and the realization that it's a statement of everybody reaching for something bigger,
sure,
something better.
On Christmas Day 1989, a global audience of 100 million watched Leonard Bernstein conduct the work in Berlin, a month after the wall that had divided the communist East from the West came down.
It's a bit odd, though, that if it starts a poem about joy, that it has so transmogrified into music about freedom.
The musical quality is so inspired in its accumulative power that it seems, and this to me is one of the reasons why it's such an important piece for very epic global occasions, that it seems that the music is so much bigger than anybody who's taking part in it.
In September 2001, just 4 days after 9/11, Leonard Slatkin conducted the choral finale at the last night of the proms as a tribute to the victims of terror. Many years later, Hector Berlioz would write that with the Ninth, Beethoven had built himself a magnificent monument and imagined the composer saying to himself, "Let death come now. My work is done." Beethoven died on the 26th of March, 1827, 3 years after completing his Ninth Symphony. He was 56. 20,000 mourners attended his funeral, 1 in 10 of the Viennese population. Among them was another symphonist, Franz Schubert. He accompanied the body to this graveyard in North Vienna, but tragically, within 2 years, barely into his 30s, he would himself be buried here, just a few meters from his great hero.
John.
Yes, this is where Schubert was first put to rest in 1828. And,
what's this part of the funeral?
It says music has laid to rest a rich treasure and still greater hopes for the future. But ironically, his 2 best symphonies were, of course, in the future. They weren't actually discovered until 1839, and the unfinished wasn't first performed until the 1860s here in Vienna.
So that's 30 years after his death.
30 years after.
During his short lifetime, Schubert acquired a reputation for his songs and piano pieces. He had actually composed over 6 symphonies. However, because they were not specially commissioned, none had a public performance in his lifetime, and the most famous was left half completed, the Unfinished Symphony.
Just before he died, he wanted to write symphonies and really concentrate on big ideas, which is why the 9th Symphony of his has this huge grand plan. I think he was intending that to be something.
The Grosse Symphony.
The Grosse Symphony, yes.
The orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment are performing the Great C Major Symphony on authentic period instruments, but Schubert himself only ever heard an orchestra play this symphony in a rehearsal in 1828 for a concert that was never given. His music was invariably performed by and for his friends, often in the comfortable surroundings of this school where his father was the headmaster.
The importance of Schubert is that you see a much more relaxed attitude to the musical material. He was really a superb composer because he could play with the music in his symphonies, playing with sound for its own sake and not worrying too much about where it's going all the time, although there is that sort of Beethoven logic as well. Spaces in the music for anybody with any ideas whatever to enter. That's part of the generosity. There's something very positive about the music, but also something very daring at the same time. Well, there's something about Schubert's music which takes the listener on a journey, and sometimes the listener doesn't know quite where it's going, and Schubert leaves the listener deliberately asking which way. The ambiguity is wonderful. It is hugely confident music, which makes it all the more tragic that he would say, "I want to write symphonies," and then died.
And later he was moved from here.
He was exhumed in 1888. The cemetery was decommissioned and his body was moved to the central cemetery, along with Beethoven, who is almost next to him here.
Oh, bye-bye, Schubert.
Bye-bye.
And here's Beethoven.
Here's Beethoven. This is where he was originally put to rest. This is a modern replacement of the original gravestone, but it's still basically the same design. It looks much more austere, doesn't it,
yes,
than Schubert?
And very much grander.
Ferdinand Schubert, Schubert's brother, claimed to have designed this. Here we have Apollo's lyre, and at the very top we have an Ouroboros. This is an old Egyptian symbol for universality, a snake consuming its own tail, and in the middle a butterfly that's meant to represent immortality.
All Beethoven's symphonies had already been published during his lifetime and began to receive public performances in major cities across Europe. Our story now takes us to Paris.
In 1825, despite fierce opposition from his father, a provincial doctor, a young medical student called Hector Berlioz quit his studies, leaving the dissection of corpses to pursue his all-consuming ambition to become a composer, a great composer. He enrolled here at the Conservatoire of Music and threw himself into his work. But not long into his studies, he had a life-changing experience, a revelation. Hector was rather prone to revelations. He heard the symphonies of Beethoven, and in particular, the first performances in France of Beethoven's Fifth. Beethoven, who had died just the previous year, was regarded by the French establishment as a German who wrote bizarre, incoherent, harsh and noisy music with no melody to speak of, disagreeable to listen to and horribly difficult to play. Berlioz thought it was wonderful. The Fifth, he said, gave wings to Beethoven's despair, but also to his nobility of soul. This style of writing is far above and beyond anything ever written in orchestral music until now. He himself, in his own words, would fire along another path.
Berlioz, of course, was a naughty boy. He never obeyed the rules when he was at the Conservatoire. And he was one of the first to say so unashamedly that music can express the self, the romantic ideal of the creative artist at loggerheads with his environment, living solely for his art. I love his music and I love everything about him, what he stood for.
This is the Place de la Bastille, named after one of the key events of the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille prison in 1789. But 1830 was also a revolutionary year, and this column commemorates the death of 1,800 Parisians who died during 3 days of bitter street fighting following a disputed election. Berlioz was excited. It was as if he would finish his musical work for the day and then dash outside, pistol in hand, to join the riots and the street fighting. His symphony was to have a story, an episode in the life of an artist in 5 parts.
Berlioz's short story was to be printed in the concert programme. Our hero falls in love with an unattainable woman. Pushed towards madness by unrequited passion, he attempts to kill himself with an overdose of opium, but the drug causes him to suffer a sequence of ever more grotesque hallucinations.
Berlioz was profoundly influenced by Beethoven's music, but he twisted the Beethoven model into startling new forms. The journey from darkness into light that we see in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony into a drug-induced descent into hell. He called his new work the Symphonie Fantastique, the Fantastic Symphony. Fantastic meaning uncanny or unreal as in a dream, but also incroyable, unbelievable, terrifying, extraordinary. And it is an extraordinary musical achievement. One of his formal innovations was the use of an idée fixe, a tune that symbolises an obsessive idea. This strange, unearthly melody lasts nearly 40 seconds and keeps recurring throughout the symphony. To gain an insight into how this actually works, I visited the composer, Robert Saxton, at his home in South London. So he keeps the tune the same right the way through the whole piece?
It appears in different guises, but it's always very recognisable. And the landscape changes around it rather than the tune itself changing.
Is this one here? Shall I play it?
Yes.
Or at the beginning of it?
Absolutely. A composer like Beethoven will take something that's more like a motif and gradually take parts out of it and develop it, whereas with Berlioz the idée fixe remains more or less intact. The opening is reverie and passions, and he's dreaming, and the idée fixe is the beloved. Yeah. That is her.
Right.
He then here introduces the tune, totally unaccompanied, and when he does put the accompaniment in, where most composers would have had a running accompaniment, he's got this jerky boom, boom, boom. Berlioz couldn't play the piano, which is significant. He played the flute and the guitar. And I think he thought in these great, long, almost folk-derived melodies.
For Berlioz, the conventional orchestra as it existed in the early 1830s was too polite and genteel sounding for his vision for the Symphonie Fantastique. For all his wild romantic imagination, he approached actually writing the score as if he was a scientist. How could he get exactly the sound that he wanted? "You big baby," he wrote, addressing an imaginary orchestra, "it's time you learn to speak properly, and I am the one to teach you."
He examined the potential of the instruments and fearlessly felt unconstrained by what had come before him.
Berlioz was a child of the Industrial Revolution. Heavy industry was transforming Europe, and the invention of the valve in the 1820s meant that there were new brass instruments. The tuba was patented within 5 years of the premiere of his symphony, and the score was revised to include its deep, smooth tones. Obsessively interested in the design of instruments and the techniques used to play them, he began to create a new type of orchestra, one that could play the music he heard in his head.
I adore this Symphonie Fantastique.
As a composer?
Yes, it's endlessly fascinating. It's quite extraordinary, the use of the orchestra, the blending of the tone colours that he uses, the extraordinary orchestration. He seems to think of the orchestra as a virtuoso instrument in itself. He's the first composer really to specify how many instruments he wants in each section. He's very specific that it's got to be 15 first violins, 15 second violins. And indeed, he asks for a 60-piece string orchestra, very large by those standards and by our standards. He extends the technique of them. He gives them tremolo to play, which is when they go like this on the string, which was quite unusual for those days.
Throughout his life, Berlioz continued to speculate about his ideal orchestra. An ensemble that would have unsurpassed rhythmic and melodic power. Eventually, he was to calculate the exact number of players this ideal would require. 467. That's more than 4 times the number of players in a modern orchestra. Even with a mere 80 or so players, the Symphonie Fantastique is an overwhelming experience, and the detailed literary programme only adds to the intensity. The Halle Orchestra are playing the march to the scaffold. Berlioz's romantic hero has a vision that he has murdered his beloved and that he is to be guillotined for the crime. His head will be laid on the block, and we will hear the idée fixe run through his mind like a final thought of his beloved, only to be literally chopped off by the fall of the blade. Bizarre though the storyline of the Symphonie Fantastique might be, the story behind the composition of the work is stranger yet. One September in 1827, Berlioz came here to the Théâtre de l'Odéon to see 2 performances of Shakespeare in English, Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. The star of the show was an Irish actress called Harriet Smithson. In Hamlet, she was Ophelia, and in Romeo and Juliet, she was, of course, playing Juliet. Berlioz fell madly in love. How could he, a humble music student, ever hope to win the heart of this great Shakespearean actress? This desire was the seed for the Symphonie Fantastique. He would write a grand symphony, be recognized as a great composer, and then he could approach the beloved Harriet as an equal. To help tell the story of their peculiar romance, I've asked my fellow actor Emma Fielding to meet me at the British Ambassador's residence in Paris.
So, 1827.
Was when Berlioz first saw Harriet in the theatre playing Ophelia and then Juliet and fell madly in love with her.
Now, it was 3 years later that he wrote the Symphonie Fantastique, which was based on his thoughts about her, and that's 1830, so it's quite a long time.
3 years, but during that time, he pursued her quite voraciously. Never actually met.
Yeah, but he didn't want to meet her, did he? He avoided her.
He avoided meeting her, but took a flat around the corner so he could follow her movements to and from the theatre.
So basically he was stalking her.
He was stalking her.
And at the end of 1832, she attends a concert, which she doesn't normally do. She's not a great classical music lover.
And she reads the programme notes of the Symphonie Fantastique and realises that it's all about her.
Which is extraordinary, because all of Paris society knew about his infatuation, but she didn't.
But she didn't. But that evening they are introduced to each other. He proposes, and she accepts.
And then 10 months later, they were married here, on the 3rd of October 1833, in the British Embassy in Paris. My 30-year war against the mediocre, the academics and the deaf. That was Berlioz's own description of his career in Paris, during which time he composed 4 symphonies in 12 years. The Symphonie Fantastique, a second symphony based on a Lord Byron poem, a massive funeral symphony, and this Shakespearean masterpiece.
The Romeo and Juliet Symphony is the 36-year-old Berlioz's musical expression of his love for both Harriet and for the works of the playwright who first brought them together. The symphony is his most sophisticated storytelling yet. The orchestra here doesn't simply evoke the story, he wants the instruments to become the actors in the play and actually deliver Shakespeare's lines. The flute and woodwinds are the voice of Juliet.
Yeah, lovely. Then we hear the cellos representing Romeo's speech. Then her fear. He had this idea that no one else had done before, that he didn't need the words if he could get the listener to think that the words might be somewhere in the orchestra.
Being actors, Emma and I couldn't resist trying an experiment here. Just how closely does Berlioz parallel Shakespeare's lines and the action from the balcony scene with his music?
Look soft. What light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun.
You can clearly hear Romeo's climb to the balcony in the cello's ardent ascending phrase, and Romeo and Juliet's blossoming love in the radiant music that follows. Berlioz strives to give the audience all the nuance and drama of Shakespeare's poetry as he himself experienced it. Shakespeare, he said, hit me like a thunderbolt and revealed in a flash of lightning the whole heaven of art. When he'd first seen Harriet portray Juliet on stage, he spoke no English. Now, 10 years later, he had mastered the language and could translate it into music.
What man art thou, that thus bescreened in night so stumblest on my counsel?
I know not how to tell thee who I am,
My name, dear saint, is hateful to myself because it is an enemy to thee.
My ears have not yet drunk 100 words of that tongue's uttering, yet I know the sound. Art thou not Romeo and a Montague?
Neither, fair saint, if either thee displease.
Years after the premiere of Romeo and Juliet, he and Harriet's marriage failed and they separated. She died a decade later. Then shortly before his own death, Berlioz returned to Grenoble in provincial France, where he'd been born. Over 60, lonely and in failing health, he was overcome by childhood memories. As a teenager, he'd been infatuated by a girl called Estelle. He now tracked her down, and though she was a widow of 70, in his imagination she seemed unchanged. "Star who brightened the morning of my life," he declared to her, "I should write you a symphony. Only with the orchestra can I express what I feel for you." Berlioz's literary symphonies realized the potential for storytelling that Beethoven had first explored with his Pastoral Symphony. But the next step forward for symphonic writing was to come from a school of thought centered on a small town in Germany called Weimar. It was dominated by these two intellectual giants. The first on the left, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and on the right, Friedrich Schiller, whose Ode to Joy Beethoven had set in his Ninth Symphony. Weimar was a powerhouse of political and philosophical thought in the middle of the 19th century, but it was one charismatic individual who was to put it on the musical map. And this is his distinctive piano arrangement of Beethoven's Ninth. He was the great Franz Liszt.
When Liszt was offered the post of artist in residence by the court here in Weimar, many people were surprised. He was the most famous piano virtuoso in Europe, a personality and a talent that had been adored and celebrated like a rock star for 20 years. But he had little experience of conducting, and most of his compositions were for the piano. Why on earth would this flamboyant man take on the unfamiliar responsibilities of executive manager and conductor that his role as Kapellmeister extraordinaire required? Well, perhaps this was part of the appeal.
Unlike Beethoven and Berlioz, who never made much money from their careers as freelance musicians, Liszt was used to an affluent and comfortable lifestyle. Accepting the patronage of the Grand Duke of Weimar now guaranteed that he could continue to live and work in the lavish style to which he'd become accustomed.
In his first decade here, he wrote a dozen, not symphonies, but symphonic poems. Single movement works that used the full orchestra to explore new ways of pursuing a musical narrative. They were all programmatic and highly literate. His sources include Schiller and Shakespeare, but they refrain from any kind of linear story. In their concentration on mood and character, they were more like illustrations than translations.
The idea was that this new music, the symphonic avant-garde, would speak to an educated audience that already knew the literature behind the work.
His compositional ideas reflected his own individuality, his own flamboyance, his own egocentric personality, perhaps one could say. And he decided to go down a very dark and macabre path. So it was natural that he would be drawn to the great German play, Goethe's Faust.
Liszt's first full-scale symphony is a powerful and disturbing orchestral companion piece to Goethe's poetic drama about a man who sells his soul to the devil. Written for the inauguration of the statue in Weimar Town Square in 1857. Liszt was genuinely thrilled by both the Faust story and by the radical ideas about art and beauty that Goethe had developed. Goethe believed that excellence and good taste could unite the polarities of classicism with its concern for balance and proportion, and the wilder philosophy of romanticism, which put the individual and his concerns at the centre of the universe. Liszt assumed that his educated audience were familiar with both Goethe's Faust and with the philosophy behind it. His ambition for his symphonic poetry was that it would convert the listener's existing intellectual thoughts into a visceral emotional reaction.
One of the best ways to look at a Liszt symphonic poem is to compare it with that period, you know, the silent film era, where the pianists were dished out with certain quotations from various pieces of music that had moods and things. So you had, you know, crisis or melancholy, and you'd go like this. Or something sentimental or pathetic. Just making that up, because Liszt is using all of these types, putting them together as a series of pictures.
Each of the symphony's three movements depicts one of the drama's three key characters, starting with Faust himself. And Liszt plunges us straight into the maelstrom of this unfortunate soul's troubled, restless thoughts. The long, slow second movement is a portrait of Gretchen, the heroine. Here, two sections of the orchestra, the violins and the woodwind, interweave to evoke a simple girl thinking about her lover whilst plucking at the petals of a flower. He loves me not. The third movement represents Mephistopheles. Liszt doesn't give Mephistopheles any original themes. Goethe maintained that evil couldn't create anything, it could only destroy. And so Faust's themes from the first movement are warped, mutilated, distorted by Mephistopheles' music, just as the hero himself succumbed to the devil. This was difficult music, sometimes violent and uncomfortable to listen to, and many would reject it as unmusical. Liszt, who had tasted success and adulation as a young piano superstar, now seemed happy to alienate casual listeners if necessary. But his ability to portray characters and their emotional lives through musical motives was to influence profoundly many of his contemporaries. Richard Wagner visited Liszt in Weimar. He called symphonic poetry the music of the future and freely admitted that he borrowed heavily from Liszt in his operas.
Aside from his actual compositions, Liszt's other great contribution to the history of the symphony is his clever keyboard transcriptions of music by Beethoven and Berlioz. In an age before recording, these elegant versions of orchestral music that you could play at home on your own piano were essential in the disseminating and popularizing of the symphony.
By the middle of the 19th century, the symphony was seen as the supreme expression of a composer's art, and its creators enshrined as heroes of the age. Here in the central Friedhof, Vienna's main cemetery, two of our great symphonists found their final resting place.
Beethoven, who was moved here some years after his death, and Schubert, reburied at the same time as Beethoven, and lying, as he wished apparently, just a few steps from his great predecessor.
However, there was a serious problem. Now that Liszt and Berlioz had perfected the form's ability to tell stories, if supported by a literary text, had the abstract, pure music model, storytelling by instrumental sounds alone, died along with Beethoven and Schubert.
But there were those who, while admitting there was a problem, refused to accept that it was insurmountable and pursued a different path, a new step forward in the history of the symphony.
In the next episode, we trace Johannes Brahms's journey into the realm of pure music. To go deeper into the music and unravel the secrets of the symphony, follow the links to the Open University at bbc.co.uk/symphony.
Stay with us here on BBC HD. It's Later with Jules Holland, coming up next.
Vienna, 1876. The place was a building site, a hub of an empire and the symphony. The Emperor Franz Joseph had decided the city wall should come down to be replaced by a prestigious urban boulevard, the Ringstrasse. Another ring, Wagner's massive music drama with its Ride of the Valkyries, was being created at the same time. Two groundbreaking moments, and both rings took about 30 years to construct.
The Austrian writer Karl Kraus said that Vienna was being demolished into a great city, with a new classical parliament building, Athena presiding at the front, a Gothic-style town hall, a Renaissance-style university. But constructed before any of these in 1868 was the Opera House. Music remained, of course, an abiding interest for the Viennese public, and at the time, debate was fierce about whether new music should be descriptive or abstract, Wagner versus Brahms.
The symphony was at the centre of this controversy. In this programme, we'll see how it emerged triumphant, how it became a vehicle for nationalist sentiment and gained genuine popular appeal, and how it became the means of intense artistic self-expression. We'll also see how composers like Dvorak, Tchaikovsky and Sibelius came to the expanding city of Vienna and exported the symphony to new nations and new worlds.
Why does a film about the symphony start with an opera, and particularly an opera by Wagner, who once declared emphatically that the symphony was dead?
The problem was how to follow a composer like Beethoven, who in his Ninth Symphony in 1824 seemed to have taken the classical four-movement form as far as it could go with its groundbreaking choral finale. Despite the attempts of his successors, was Beethoven the final word in symphonic writing? Richard Wagner certainly thought so, and when he held the first performance of The Ring, his massive music drama, at his specially built theatre in Bayreuth, he began it with Beethoven's Ninth, as if to say, roll over Beethoven, now it's my turn. Wagner's Ring is a cycle of 4 operas over 4 evenings, 15 hours of music telling the story of humanity from dawn to dusk. The premiere in 1876 wasn't just a musical event, but a political event, attended by crowned heads of Europe. Everybody who was anybody was there. But all the drama over The Ring made someone want to stand up for the symphony. Johannes Brahms, 20 years Wagner's junior, was a classicist who was ready to fight for pure symphonic music.
The arena for this particular contest was Vienna's new concert hall, the Musikverein. The land for the building was donated by the Emperor Franz Joseph. It was built by the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, the Society of Friends of Music, and it was opened in 1870.
Brahms was from Hamburg in northern Germany, brought up in the Protestant Lutheran tradition, although he didn't stay a believer. He'd been working on his first symphony for 14 years, all the time he'd been in Vienna. Brahms had already made it clear that writing a symphony after Beethoven's Ninth was no joke. You've no idea, he said, how it feels to hear behind you the tramp of a giant like Beethoven. Although he was over 40 at this stage and had certainly taken his time, the fuss over Wagner's Ring had made him determined to finish the symphony ready for a premiere in 1876. After initial performances in Germany, Brahms himself conducted his first symphony here at the Musikverein on the 17th of December of that year as part of celebrations for Beethoven's birthday. The hall was packed, but not with the heads of state who went to Wagner's premiere in Bayreuth. The decor may be opulent, but the Musikverein wasn't built for the aristocracy, but for the Viennese middle class.
When the hall was opened, it was the first concert hall in Vienna, real, definite, great concert hall, and every new work was welcomed highly. The audience was very much interested in hearing contemporary music, because at that time, the only interesting things were new things.
Brahms's new symphony was written for what is now the modern symphony orchestra. The music for this programme is played by the BBC Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Mark Elder.
By the time he started writing his greatest pieces, Brahms had mastered the legacy of Beethoven and turned it into something even more muscular than Beethoven's music was. But he had the vision of how great symphonic masterpieces could aim at the highest emotional planes. Every great symphonic writer takes an audience on an emotional narrative journey through the piece. For me, that's one of the definitions of a great symphony. The French horn such a symbol of romantic energy, has an heroic feel to it as well. And this is something that possibly Brahms could have taken from Beethoven. But underneath it, the strings shimmer, and that's something I think that Beethoven wouldn't have done in that same way. That sense of contacting nature, just like the romantic paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, is very vivid, memorable, and superbly well done. That contact with nature is then surprisingly interrupted by a chorale on the trombones. And this Protestant, perhaps Lutheran chorale, recalling Brahms's musical past, but also perhaps his own childhood, calms the soul. And from that sense of stillness sings the last movement's main tune. Now this tune, in C major, the primary key, has a whiff of the great tune at the last movement of Beethoven's Choral Symphony that introduces the Ode to Joy. And when somebody pointed that out to Brahms, he said, "Oh, any silly ass can see that."
Brahms's symphony was a great success, and the enthusiasm was further promoted by music critics. The most important was Edvard Hanslick, who also fanned the flames of the Brahms-Wagner debate.
The rise of the critic here in Vienna was very important. It's inconceivable now, I think, to think of a major critic like Hanslick writing a long article on the front page of the Neue Freie Presse, which is the equivalent of the London Times, going on to page 2 and to page 3 about the first performance in Vienna of Brahms's First Symphony, which he did. And people would read that at breakfast, you know, alongside international news on the front page of the paper.
In his front page article, which surprisingly hasn't been translated into English before, Hanslick wrote, "It must be recognized by friend and foe alike that no other composer has come as close to the greatest creations of Beethoven as Brahms has in the finale of his symphony." Hanslick, of course, was very much a friend of Brahms and pure music, and a foe of Wagner, whom he felt was destroying melody and form in favor of philosophizing.
Wagner's argument was that music is not pure. One can use music politically as well as aesthetically to raise all sorts of questions about society, about people's psychology, what music does to them, what music can have an effect on an audience in this space. Just imagine the Götterdämmerung music sounding in this space against all these classical things. But the idea is to convey ideas with the music, and Wagner is a composer of ideas.
In 1875, Wagner himself had conducted excerpts from the Ring here in the Musikverein to build up an appetite for the premiere at Bayreuth. Mark Elder is demonstrating, perhaps controversially, that while Wagner was writing mythological music dramas for the opera house, he was also composing symphonically.
In my view, Wagner was one of the greatest symphonic composers. By that I mean that he invented a large number of little themes, motives associated with the characters, the actions, the events, even places, objects. And he wrote the opera, he set his words, accompanied them with this enormously elaborate orchestral texture.
Can you give me an example of a theme that he might use?
Yes, I mean, let's look at Siegfried and Brunhilde, the heroine and the hero. When we first see them, their music is very, very different, and it's quite clear which pieces belong to which character. Now, here's one for Brunhilde. Tender, loving, affectionate, gentle, big intervals expressing big emotions, but in a small dynamic. Now, another one that he needs, of course, is to portray his hero, Siegfried. Listen to this. Altogether grander, heroic, masculine in its strong rhythm and its clear-cut idea. Now, that little tune, short as it is, can then later on appear even shorter when she speaks of their love, the things that join them together, and she changes it to suit the occasion. Now, this process of developing the characters of the themes is what I would call the symphonic process that he was engaged in. And by the time he'd finished The Ring, he'd got the full flow of it, and his attitude towards how he used these little themes and musical ideas to suit the drama became really loose, became very free. And sometimes we can't quite understand why that particular little musical idea is embedded in the jewellery of the texture.
So he released the themes from the story?
A bit, yes. Yes, he did. In order to write gorgeous symphonic music, to build up the themes into great architectural masses of sound. I mean, really beautiful.
It's hard to appreciate now just how divided musical opinion across Europe was and how polarised it became between two warring camps. Wagner didn't just have fans, he had worshippers. And one of the most important was a young organist and composer called Anton Bruckner. Bruckner was a provincial boy born near Linz. He became a choir boy and organist in the Augustinian monastery of St. Florian. He was a very devout Catholic. Mahler described him as half simpleton, half god. His third symphony was dedicated to Wagner and premiered here at the Musikverein in December 1877, just 1 year after Brahms's first.
The effect of Wagner is huge. Not that Bruckner's music sounds like Wagner, it doesn't. It's much more bold harmonically, but Wagner showed him how you can organize huge spaces of music, how you could use harmony and expressiveness to fill out large spaces of time in music. It hadn't been done before.
His symphonies were built with huge blocks of stone gradually being built up, like a cathedral, not a parish church. And of course, for many people, that music takes them closer to their God. The great spiritual dimension that he as a man had is reflected in these enormous edifices musically.
The scale of Bruckner 3, it lasts for well over an hour, is reflected in the urban expansion of Vienna itself. Between 1860 and 1900, the city trebled in size from 500,000 to 1.5 million inhabitants.
The symphonies reflected more the fears of what was going on rather than the triumph, which is why I think Bruckner's symphonies took a long time to get a foothold in Vienna.
Brahms had described the typical Bruckner symphony as like a massive boa constrictor, and the concert here at the Musikverein was a disaster, with much of the audience walking out before the end.
Bruckner's eccentric, monumental symphonies were eventually accepted in Vienna, of course, but both Bruckner and Mahler didn't really enter the international repertoire until the 1960s and 70s. Their symphonies are long, groundbreaking works, full of ambition but also anxiety, like the city in which the composers lived.
This is Franz Josef, depicted as Caesar on the front of the Parliament building in Vienna. Franz Josef ruled over 17 distinct nationalities within the Habsburg Empire, but many of these weren't that happy about being included in such a vast conglomerate and rose up in revolt in 1848. It was after this difficult time that Franz Josef, then only 18, was placed on the throne and began his long reign of 68 years. But nationalist pressure wouldn't go away. Many demands went unmet, and nationalist resentment intensified, particularly in Bohemia.
A year ago, wrote a Leipzig newspaper in 1880, news flashed across the German music world of a miraculous talent residing in Prague. What heightens the charm of Dvorak's compositions is the sharply etched nationality that accompanies them. In the symphonic world, as in the political arena, nationalism was becoming a potent force.
Dvorak's father was a butcher, but he also ran the local inn, so the boy must have grown up with the sounds of celebratory singing and dancing. His sixth symphony was written for the Vienna Philharmonic, but in fact it was premiered here in Prague in 1881. The Vienna Philharmonic didn't get around to playing it until 1942. Dvorak used Brahms's symphonies as his model, but instead of the typical scherzo or intermezzo movement, he wrote a furiant, a Bohemian folk dance that became his distinctive calling card.
What gives the furiant its bounce is the way it shifts between 2-beat and 3-beat rhythms, which stems from the nature of the dance.
The man here is performing his masculinity, and he takes advantage of this 2/4 measure to show how he is strong, how he is proud, how he is clever. it's always during this 3/4 measure that it's the dancing in the couple and about the dancing of the woman also. Dvořák understood very well the nature of the dance, what was the spirit of the dance. So I think in this way he was very accurate.
I noticed that the dance was a bit slower. Dvořák speeded it up quite a lot, didn't he?
Yes, because it was virtuosity that he wanted to show, but it was not written for a dance. But so when you need to dance, so the music has to be slow.
Why did he include this dance in his symphony?
Because it had the meaning of the national feeling. So I think this was important for them to show the national identity in the music.
What Dvořák is trying to do is to take the symphony away from the elite audience to a much wider audience. And in this, he's a very modern composer, although he's not regarded as that today.
This is Vysoká, 60 kilometers southwest of Prague, where Dvořák had a summer house. He came here during the summer months to compose, to escape the pressures of a busy life in the city. The house remains in the Dvořák family and has been left very much as it was when Dvořák died in 1904.
This is my grandmother, Dvořák's wife, when she married. She was 18 years old in this time. She was 3 months pregnant. It was unusual in this time, but it was reality. Yes.
This desk, is this where he wrote?
Sitting in this little table, Dvořák wrote many great opuses.
It's tiny, it's very small,
yes.
isn't it?
The 8th Symphony was written here in Vysoká, sure. Very interesting is this picture. Dvořák's family on the steps on the 17th East Street in New York. Here is my grandfather, and here are 2 boys. One of these boys is my father.
You didn't know your grandfather?
I was born 25 years after his death.
That's a wonderful picture.
This picture, Dvořák sitting on the bench and feeding his pigeons here.
Here?
Here by this house.
Oh, it's down
yes,
there?
Yes, it is here.
This has various scores on it.
Manuscripts and other, yes.
Dvořák came to popularity through his Slavonic dances, following the success of Brahms with his Hungarian dances. Brahms, of course, was imitating Hungarian gypsies he'd heard in Vienna, but Dvořák penned his Furians and other Slavic dances with national pride.
This room was the dining room of the family. Very special is this picture. Dvořák and his 2 friends, Tchaikovsky, Johannes Brahms. Especially Johannes Brahms was a very good friend of my grandfather, and Brahms don't believe in God. And Dvořák said once about him, how it is possible that Brahms composed so nice music when he don't believe?
Brahms admired Dvořák's music and did a great deal to help the composer. But in general, the attitude of the Viennese musical establishment was condescending, if not downright dismissive. For the Austrians, nationalist composers like Tchaikovsky and Dvorak were colourful but not serious. Once, when someone expressed his admiration for Dvorak's skillful and brilliant orchestration, Bruckner said, "You can paint a pair of sausages blue and green, but they're still a pair of sausages."
In 1890, a young composer came from much farther afield to continue his studies in Vienna. Jean Sibelius came from Finland, way beyond the reach of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but Vienna was the place properly to study the symphonic tradition. He was a huge fan of Wagner's, but also admired Beethoven's Ninth and Bruckner's Third, and here, in this symphonic hothouse, it was inevitable that he should set about to write a symphony. And as with Dvorak, it took on national overtones. Sibelius looked for inspiration to the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala. Elias Lönnrot, who compiled the Kalevala, published his final version in 1849. He'd travelled extensively into remote parts of Karelia, an area that covers parts of eastern Finland and Russia, where he collected folk songs and poetry from peasant bards, and he reworked these into a long, rambling tale of over 22,000 verses. With the figure of the bard Väinämöinen, a sort of Finnish Orpheus at its heart, the Kalevala became a major inspiration for artists, musicians, and advocates of a Finnish national identity.
This is the autograph score of Kullervo by Jean Sibelius.
From the mass of different stories and mythological characters in the Kalevala, Sibelius focused on the tragic anti-hero Kullervo in his choral symphony.
And here you can see the program text, the Kalevala, in the score.
Here we go.
Here we go. Here is the first.
Oh God, it's always so exciting.
Music page.
Now, why was the Kalevala so important to Finnish national aspirations?
First of all, because it was in Finnish, and it was Finnish folk poetry. It has been said that Kalevala showed to us Finns that Finland had its own history already before the Christian era or the Swedish or Russian era.
After 6 centuries of Swedish domination, the Grand Duchy of Finland became part of the Russian Empire in 1809, and Helsinki became something of a showcase for the Russian Emperor Alexander I. The central Senate Square of the city is very much in the St. Petersburg style. This statue of Alexander II was built in 1894. He was remembered as the good Tsar, a reformer. Unlike most nationalities within the Russian Empire, the Finns enjoyed a degree of autonomy, but during the 1890s, the Russians began to limit this, and this inevitably fueled the Finnish nationalist movement. With Kullervo, written in 1892, and of course Finlandia, his patriotic piece par excellence, which was composed in 1899, Sibelius found himself a national, even nationalist figure. This painting, called Symposium, depicts a gathering of artists and musicians of the time. It shows Sibelius on the right, Robert Kajanus, who conducted the premiere of the Kullervo Symphony, next to him. The figure worse for wear is a music critic, oblivious to everything. And the fourth character is the artist himself, Akseli Gallen-Kallela, a good friend of Sibelius. He's famous for his Kalevala paintings, and I went to the Athenaeum Gallery to find out more.
There are statistics about the popularity of Kalevala stories in Finnish art and visual art and culture in general. And through all times, Kullervo, his very tragic story, has been the most popular story and motive from Kalevala. And thinking about the times when Kullervo has been most popular was exactly the time of young Sibelius, young Galen Kallela, the turn of the 19th century, 1890s. So there is a strong link to the times when Finnish national identity was being threatened.
Sibelius' Kullervo Symphony tells the tragic story of Kullervo seducing a woman he meets, who he finds out later is his sister. But Sibelius' depiction of this with its aggressive brass is remarkable in 19th century music and makes it sound more like rape than seduction.
Here we arrive to the climax of the third movement, a very powerful culmination of the movement.
Ah, yes, there'll be all the brass here.
Yeah.
Playing very, very loudly indeed.
Yes.
Sibelius arrived just at the right time, as the Finns were really dying to get out from underneath the yoke of being dominated and run by Russia. And there was this extraordinary, rough, wild, undisciplined, unreliable individual. And he found, through his long life, a way to express the feeling in his people and in his love for his country. But he never wanted to be thought of as a nationalist composer. He never wanted to have a political message. His music came from his own rigour inside himself that he eventually worked at and found, and through his own natural gifts of drama in music.
Sibelius wanted his music to express a nationalism, but also be internationally well known as well. And he was so popular in England and America because, unlike Germany, these two countries also did not have a great institutional musical culture behind them. When you think about Germany, an opera house in every city, a symphony orchestra and so forth, it's not the case in England and certainly not the case in America. So you have someone with Beethovenian ambitions trying to establish something meaningful in the symphony that's an alternative to the German tradition.
In 1907, Gustav Mahler came to Helsinki to conduct a concert, and he met the painter Galen Kallela, whom he knew from an exhibition in Vienna, and he met Sibelius. Taking a walk one day, the two composers discussed symphonic form. Sibelius said that he admired the severity and logic of the form, that created inner connections between the motifs. Mahler replied that his opinion was very different. A symphony should be like the world, he said. It should embrace everything. This is the Secession Building in Vienna, one of the finest examples of an artistic movement known as Jugendstil, the young style. And here is Gustav Mahler as a heroic knight in shining armor, painted by his friend Gustav Klimt. This frieze, which pictures Beethoven's Ninth Symphony as seen through Wagner's eyes, was painted for a great Beethoven exhibition in 1902, at which Mahler conducted an arrangement of the Ninth Symphony. Mahler's Third Symphony picks up on the idea of Beethoven's Ode to Joy, but as well as harking back to that, it looks out with ferocious energy onto a new world. Klimt's vision, like Mahler's, is a very personal one. The first wall represents heroic ambition, featuring Mahler, of course. The second wall represents the obstacles that mankind has to overcome, including animal instincts. And the final section, taking its cue from Schiller's lyrics in the Ode to Joy, shows the kiss to the whole world that comes at the end of Beethoven's Ninth. Mahler's Third is a symphony that pushes the form to its limits. It has 6 movements, and at nearly 100 minutes in length, it's one of the longest symphonies in the repertoire. The first movement represents the unstoppable forces of nature. Summer is the victor amidst all that is blooming and growing. It's about the whole of creation. Mahler moves on to flowers, animals, mankind, and the angels, but of course it's really about Mahler himself. This, after all, is the Vienna of Freud, and the symphony has become a vehicle for self-expression, as well as a picture of the artist's vision of the world around him.
Mahler was fascinated at the opportunity of stretching the orchestra, making it do things that no one else had dared go to. And his interest in this very, very extreme sound worlds came from everything that he was, a very complex personality, a man who gave up his Jewish faith to become a Christian to help himself do better in Vienna and run the opera. A man who was brought up in a tiny village way out in the countryside that had a very substantial barracks in it. And so his childhood was full of military marching music and strange out-of-tune fanfares.
Now this is pretty rare, isn't it, everybody? That this little word, ROH, does not stand for Royal Opera House. It stands for the word which means unrefined, raw, yeah? Strident. Now it's not so much that it needs to be very loud, it just needs to have a particular bite and edge to it, doesn't it? Yeah? Not wholly musical. Can I hear it? Okay, good. That's better. If the horns were a bit softer and a little bit edgier, I think it would be better, and also earlier. It's late. 2, 3, 4. Let me just address what the oboes are going to do. Can I just hear it? The 3 Fs? Yeah. It says grell. Well, that just means shrill. This just sounds like loud oboe playing. It sounds great. It sounds quality. It should not sound quality. It should sound strident and exaggerated. And it's been suggested that the best way to do it is just to actually put the reed further in the mouth. just to actually put it all further in. Would you just try that? Don't worry. If it sounds distorted, that's what he wants. 1, 2, 3. That's it. That's better. 1, 2, 3. What he was trying to do was to experiment with how far the orchestra could be taken. And in this way, of course, he was a great successor to Berlioz, who wanted to do the same thing in his time. And in a way, that makes Mahler the first of the great 20th century composers.
Mahler composed during his holidays. His day job was here as conductor and director of the court opera. Born in Bohemia and raised as a Jew, Mahler was always the outsider. Being a Jew, he said, was like being born with a short arm and having to swim twice as hard. And indeed, despite his obvious talents, he came up against anti-Semitism. But salvation was at hand. Symphonic culture had become all the rage 1,000 miles away, and Mahler, along with nationalist composers Dvorak, Tchaikovsky and Sibelius, was imported to plant the seed of a new musical culture. America, and particularly New York, provided a new and highly lucrative market for European musical culture. Tchaikovsky was invited to attend the opening of the Carnegie Hall in 1891. Mahler came to conduct the New York Symphony Orchestra and at the Metropolitan Opera. And Dvorak was asked to head the National Conservatory, where his annual salary of $15,000 was nearly 30 times more than he was earning at the Conservatoire in Prague. Most significantly, however, it was here in New York that Dvorak composed his Symphony No. 9, From the New World, which was premiered in 1893. On December the 16th, 1893, the New World Symphony was premiered here at the Carnegie Hall. First of all, can you tell me something about Mr. Carnegie?
Well, he was possibly the most successful industrialist of his age. At one time, he was reckoned to be the richest man in the world. He was a steelmaker. But also, he was an unbelievable philanthropist. And, of course, he created Carnegie Hall. But that came about because his wife sang in a chorus, and there was no concert hall. So, as you do, she asked him to build a concert hall for her. And instead of going to the greatest architect of the day, he went to the guy who was the treasurer of the Choral Society, who was a cellist, he was a musician, but he wasn't well known, and asked him to build a concert hall. He'd never built one in his life before. He sent him around Europe to look at all the concert halls and came back and built something unlike anything he'd seen.
Now, the concert itself, it was conducted by Anton Seidl, who was a big international figure, is that right?
Absolutely. He was assistant to Hans Richter, assisted with conducting the Ring Cycle in Bayreuth. I mean, he came here, in fact, he was a great Wagnerian, so he conducted a lot of Wagner here as well. So he made a huge impact here. He was the most important musician in New York.
Despite being built by a novice, Carnegie Hall was praised for its acoustics, and it soon became the landmark in American cultural life that it remains today. All across America, in Boston and Chicago, for instance, symphony halls were built and a new entrepreneurial and middle class went to the symphony to hear symphonies. And Dvorak was there to help them Americanize a European musical culture.
Dvorak was important because as a Czech, he had created Czech culture by, in a sense, taking international culture, which was really German, taking out the Germanisms and putting in Czechisms. And it was hoped that he would come to the United States, take out the Czechisms, put in Americanisms, and be a kind of object lesson for American composers about how one makes national music that belongs to them rather than to some other distant culture.
Dvorak stayed in America for 2.5 years. He was taken to Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which also included Native American musicians. And amongst his pupils at the conservatory were several African Americans, notably the singer Henry T. Burley and composer Will Marion Cook, who went on to teach Duke Ellington. In the Negro Melodies of America, Dvorak said, "I discover all that is needed for a great and noble school of music." When he arrived in America, Dvorak was given articles and musical material that he might use in his compositions.
One of the most famous was a journal called Negro Music, with an article by somebody with the improbable name of Johann Tanzor that had 6 examples of black music. And it seems that Dvorak certainly drew on these for the composition of the New World Symphony. Here's one fragment of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Which is very much like what we have in the New World Symphony.
And do we know anything about the author of this Johann Tanzor?
Johann Tanzor doesn't exist. Johann Tanzor was a name made up by a wonderful woman who was an ethnographer of African-American music from Kentucky named Mildred Hill, who was, I think, the only person Dvorak came into contact with whose music was more famous than Dvorak's because she wrote Happy Birthday.
The other American culture that attracted Dvorak's interest was that of the Native Americans. He didn't hear much of their music, but was captivated by the Hiawatha story.
Dvorak became deeply involved with Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. He'd known it as a young man. The Czech translator was a friend of his. Dvorak told critic Henry Krehbiel that the Largo was based on a chapter called Hiawatha's Wooing. And I believe it represents Hiawatha and Minnehaha's journey through primeval American spaces. It was originally faster, but under the influence of the Wagnerian conductor, Anton Seidl, it turned from probably an andante to a larghetto, and then we see it crossed out on the manuscript. Larghetto, crossed out. Largo finally appearing there as the speed, with some equation between the slowness and the deep expressivity of the passage.
We've arrived up here, in fact, where Dvorak sat.
In box 10.
Absolutely.
So how was it received?
It was received incredibly. Everybody loved the music, and I think what was important was it related to them as well. I mean, there was American themes. It was a piece for America and of America in America.
Writing about the premiere, James Gibbons Huneker, the journalist who'd given Dvorak the article with Negro tunes, acknowledged the new hybrid soil in which this musical culture was taking root. Dvorak's symphony is American, is it? Themes from Negro melodies composed by a Bohemian, conducted by a Hungarian and played by Germans in a hall built by a Scotchman. It will probably be many years before a concert will be talked and written about as was this one. The New York Conservatory folded during the Depression in the 1930s, and the house where Dvorak lived and composed the New World Symphony was demolished in 1991. But his influence on American music was lasting. His famous Largo sounds so much like a Negro spiritual that it was given words by one of his pupils, William Arms Fisher, and famously recorded by African-American singer Paul Robeson. It's become a piece of American popular music.
Just going
At this time, having a symphonic tradition proved you were a proper nation. That's why America wanted Dvorak to create one, just as the powerful Russian Empire had done a generation earlier using elements of their folk music. Here in St. Petersburg, most successful at combining the national soul with Germanic tradition was Tchaikovsky, writing symphonic music that was passionate and emotional. In October 1893, Tchaikovsky's latest symphony, his sixth, had its premiere here at the Philharmonic Hall, conducted by the composer himself. Partly because of its immense popularity, Tchaikovsky's music is often dismissed, but this symphony, known as the Pathétique, is one of the most original and deeply personal ever written. Tchaikovsky may have been using a public form, but it's a work that's full of private emotion.
Вообще очень трудно говорить, сидя на том месте, где Чайковский впервые исполнил эту симфонию. О Бетховене-то можно сказать, что Бетховен в своих симфониях обращается не к залу, а к миру. И все симфонии его разговор с человечеством. Он хочет переделать мир. И разница между Бетховеном и Чайковским, наверное, Чайковский обращается не к залу даже, а к каждому персонально, кто сидит в зале. Такое впечатление, что он только с ним разговаривает.
Tchaikovsky did in the Pathétique that was so unusual was to replace an uplifting finale with a searing, slow movement, descending into despair.
The last movement seems to be an epitaph or a farewell, full of the most glorious melodic material that rises to a desperate climax, as if he was ridding himself of some deep, deep hidden pain before allowing itself to come to rest in the final bars, so movingly.
No symphony before had ever ended like this. And of course, it has since acquired an even greater power because Tchaikovsky died just 9 days after the premiere. There was something very personal that Tchaikovsky wanted to say in this piece, but in retrospect, it also seems like a requiem for the old Europe, which couldn't last much longer, with big destructive changes to come, which is what we'll be looking at next time. To go deeper into the music and unravel the secrets of the symphony, follow the links to the Open University at bbc.co.uk/symphony. Vienna 1912. The certainties of empire were falling away and cataclysmic wars were looming. Through the course of the 20th century, the world would change faster than ever before. And composers responded to those changes too. The symphony now connected continents, reached vast new audiences, and inevitably ended up in the front line. Mahler's Ninth Symphony, his last, was given its first performance here in Vienna in 1912, a year after the composer's death. In part a radical new musical vision, in part a nostalgic yearning for the past, the last bars of the piece fade away gently into silence. The time for the triumphant apotheosis at the end of the symphony, as in Beethoven's Ninth, was over. But for how long? In the first decades of the 20th century, Russia was in turmoil. Here in St. Petersburg, then called Petrograd, revolutionaries deposed the Tsar with the hope of creating a new world. The composer Dmitri Shostakovich claimed that as a boy he was here at the Finland railway station when Lenin returned to Russia in 1917 to lead the revolution. Shostakovich remembered walking on Nevsky Prospect in a funeral procession for victims of the revolution, and he composed a funeral march for them. He was a musical prodigy, enrolling at the Music Conservatoire aged only 13 in 1919. His first symphony was his graduation piece and the first significant music of the Soviet regime. At Shostakovich's old apartment in St. Petersburg, I met Olga Digonskaya, who looks after the archive of his music.
Первая симфония вообще сыграла колоссальную роль в жизни самого Шостаковича. Он не зря потом считал, что родился именно с этой симфонией. Он отмечал ее день рождения, первое исполнение этой симфонии, приглашал гостей в ресторан на протяжении всей своей жизни. Он показывал себя этой симфонией, заявлял властно о себе. Мир с интересом, благодаря ему, смотрел на советскую Россию. Это было знаковое сочинение в тот момент.
When Shostakovich was 16, his father died, and to earn money for the family, he started playing the piano for silent movies at this cinema just around the corner from the Shostakovich apartment.
Ему нравилась, видимо, вот эта смена кадра, эта кинематографичность, эта броскость, эта стремительность, которая отражала современную жизнь. Поэтому этот этап, он был мучителен для композитора, но он был, несомненно, для него очень полезным.
Gareth, try a little softer at the beginning, sweeter. And then as we go, I broaden out in the second bar for you as you fill out the sound.
Mark Elder is working with the BBC Symphony Orchestra on the highly contrasted music of this symphony.
Okay, let's have another go. Just play 4, everybody. This first symphony seems to me to be the soundtrack for a silent movie. I don't know what the story is, but he uses the orchestra as a cast of characters. It's very, very funny. He had such a wicked sense of humour, something, of course, that Stalin knocked out of him completely later on in his life. Just once again. 2, 3, 4, 1. And a man so influenced by the other art forms in the theatre and in cinema. And all that comes together in this first symphony.
In these early years of the revolution, art was integral to the message. Agitprop poster art took propaganda to the villages. And in Petrograd, the concert halls, music halls and cinemas played to a new proletarian audience.
I think it's easy to forget now that the avant-garde was an international phenomenon in the 1920s that also reached the Soviet Union. People in the theatre were still doing radical things in Moscow and St. Petersburg. There was also a feeling that the 1920s were the beginning and the end of an era, so there was this kind of dark cloud hanging over the era as well. So you have in Shostakovich's First Symphony both of these things together.
Artists in Russia during the 1920s were experimenting with the radical and the innovative, but it wasn't to last. Under Stalin, socialist realism became state policy in 1932, and composers were expected to serve society and reflect the life around them in the most optimistic light. It was a requirement that was to cause Shostakovich problems on several occasions.
In the fourth movement, Shostakovich shows himself to be the master of, already at the age of 19, the portrayal of terror. More than any other 20th century composer, in my view, he is able to put into sound the feelings that we all have after a nightmare, after being frightened by some unexpected event in our lives. And let's face it, the Soviets knew a lot about living under terror.
Although it was a 19-year-old's graduation piece, Shostakovich's First Symphony was a huge success. Within a year it was performed in Berlin, Vienna, Philadelphia and Buenos Aires. Nikolai Malko, who conducted the premiere, wrote in his diary, "I feel as if we have started a new page in the history of symphonic music." Whilst Shostakovich was quickly picked up as the musical face of communist Russia, Charles Ives, a composer in capitalist America, was so ahead of his time his music still isn't well known today. Born in New England, Ives drew on the folk, popular and church music he heard around him, putting them together in a new way in pieces like his Holidays Symphony. This is the house in Danbury, Connecticut, where Charles Ives was born in 1874. Ives is one of history's more eccentric composers, a true American original. While Shostakovich, as a boy, composed a funeral elegy for victims of the Revolution, Ives composed a funeral elegy for his pet cat, and after popular acclamation, wrote other elegies for his neighbours' animals.
This is the bed where Charles Ives was born, October 20th, 1874. That rocking chair I know is original, and this is very special. This is the cradle, and he was laid in that cradle. And that was the beginning of the Charles Ives that we all know and many of us love.
Charles Ives received an impeccable musical education. His father, George Ives, was a music teacher and band leader.
George Ives's band would play for marches and for holidays, memorial services. He was considered Danbury's brass band.
We're sitting in the parlor, and surrounding us is Main Street. And Charles Ives' father, George, who had been the youngest band director in the Union Army in the Civil War, he used to rehearse the kids and the adults who played in these community bands, and they would march back and forth up and down the hill. And Charles Ives absolutely absorbed everything that happened on Main Street.
The piece that we're playing tonight is called Holiday Quick Step. One of the very first things that Charles Ives wrote, he was 17 years old when he wrote it. It's really quite well constructed for somebody that young. It's a nice piece of music.
Charles Ives was in his mid-30s when he composed his Second Symphony, a decade before his more radical Holidays Symphony. Completed in 1909, it didn't get its first performance until 1951, with Leonard Bernstein conducting.
He was an incredible visionary. He wanted to try and find a sort of American beauty, one that would represent to him the voice of his people and his land. He wanted to write a European symphony with the movements corresponding roughly to the scale and proportions and colours of a European model, but he wanted all the material to be American tunes.
to prove that America could hold its head high and do something that was worthy of Beethoven and Brahms and all the others that had come before.
Although he took the European Symphony as his starting point, Ives certainly wasn't slavish in his admiration for that tradition. You can learn more from a day in a Kansas wheat field, he once said, than 3 years in Europe. And when told by his father that a symphony generally finished in the same key it started in, he replied that was just as silly as having to die in the same house that you were born in.
He didn't want to make his living with music because if he had to make a living in music, he had to be able to sell what he wrote. And he had no intention of having to write to cater to your taste or to my taste or to anybody's taste. It was more important to him to write music that maybe people would like someday. Sure, everybody likes to be liked, but he didn't really care. So what did he do instead? He went and he sold insurance. As a matter of fact, he became a millionaire selling insurance. And in doing that, he didn't have to worry about selling his music.
Much of Ives's experimentalism came directly from his father, who, amongst other things, got him to sing and play the piano in 2 different keys at the same time.
One of his father's experiments that I know Charles Ives was really interested in because it's well documented, his dad had one band march out of St. Peter Church on Main Street. And then he had another band coming from Richfield, and they were marching the opposite direction, playing 2 different pieces of music. And the effect of the 2 different pieces of music, you can hear it in almost everything Charles Ives later wrote.
He was the first person, certainly in America, to write 2 different things going on at the same time. 1 or 2 of his pieces, I find, work best when you have 2 conductors. And you say to part of the orchestra, don't follow me, follow the other guy. And you somehow try and meet in the middle. Because he had this idea of overlapping musical events, then finally coming together. Some of his favorite march tunes, popular songs, and above all, one of his favorites, Columbia, Gem of the Ocean, which comes at the end of the symphony, roaring out on all the trombones. So he needs to bring all this to a finale. And there's this great moment when 3 or 4 tunes are played by different parts of the orchestra, all at the same time. Farewell gesture is a raspberry. Now the thing about this is that he wrote a short note, like bah, as if it was a slap across the face with this strange dissonant chord. And then I listened to Lenny Bernstein's performance, which is so wonderful and so inspiring. And blow me down, he extended it. It was like a blur rather than a boom. And I think it works best that way. That's great.
Back in Europe, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had imploded in the First World War, and Vienna was no longer the musical centre it had been. The symphony had been taken up by new national voices.
In Britain, the land without music, as the Germans dubbed it, The musical world received a new lease of life through the work of Edward Elgar, whose first symphony was extremely well received, even in Germany. A new generation of composers sprang up, among them Ralph Vaughan Williams, who studied here at the Royal College of Music. He felt strongly the need to create a national style, whatever that might mean. We English composers, he said, are always saying, here are Wagner and Brahms and Grieg and Tchaikovsky, what fine fellows they are. Let us try and do something like this at home, always forgetting that it will not sound at all like this when transplanted from its native soil. He was passionately interested in folk song, of course, and this permeates his music, although it also, of course, led to accusations of parochialism in some of his pieces, like the Pastoral Symphony.
Many people dismiss a lot of the romantic English music written in the first half of the 20th century with the unfortunate label of cowpat music. And I think one has to find the strength and the spine in this music and not allow it to meander, just like a little stream drifting through a landscape. And of course, the countryside in this symphony doesn't mean sheep and shepherds and Arcadia at all. It means the countryside of the First World War, the Somme, northern France, where Vaughan Williams went as a stretcher bearer, working with the ambulance corps. You have this feeling of something never sitting down, but always shifting. Many of the melodies being in modes rather than in keys. The modes that came from originally religious music or folk songs. And it's not at all the landscape of cherished abundancy. It's the landscape of death. And in the middle of this desecrated landscape, he heard somebody practicing the bugle, distantly in a trench. It was a haunting sound. And he's put it into this landscape of the second movement, which is very, very sad music. You have to play it on a special instrument, which won't have all the notes necessarily in tune, you know, like a natural horn or a natural trumpet. And so it sounds a bit bittersweet.
Because many modernist composers in the 1920s rejected the symphony as a 19th century form, composers like Vaughan Williams, who wrote 9 in total, were often dismissed as old-fashioned and conservative.
The symphony has always been a public genre where you have to talk to a lot of people through music in a big space. People like Vaughan Williams, Elgar and Sibelius, they are not necessarily not modern. In my view, they are actually more important than the avant-garde in many ways, because they're saying very important things about modernity to this large audience, sometimes very disconcerting things.
Since the 19th century, there'd been a continuing debate about whether symphonies needed to say anything at all.
Whilst Ives was kicking up a storm with his popular American marches, and Shostakovich was celebrating the October Revolution and the 1st of May in his second and third symphonies, in Finland, Sibelius was pursuing the old classical idea of pure music. In 1904, he moved here to a specially built house where he could work in peace in the landscape that he loved so much. And it was here in 1924 that he produced his 7th symphony, a symphony distilled into one continuous movement. After the vast canvases of Bruckner and Mahler, here was Sibelius paring things down and producing a symphony that was just 20 minutes long. Ainola, Sibelius' house, is just 40 kilometers from Helsinki, but feels a world away. He lived here for the last 50 years of his life.
Let's have a look at Sibelius' last study and bedroom. And Sibelius wrote most of his pieces on this desk, not on the piano.
It's quite simple, isn't it? Are there cigars?
Yes, everywhere in this house.
He loves smoking.
Cigar boxes.
Look, there's tuning fork.
Yes, yes.
So this is where he composed all his symphonies.
He made long day walks around here, many hours, thinking and composing in his head. And when he had something...
He came back here.
Yes.
Marvelous.
This is the autograph score of Sibelius' last symphony, Symphony number 7. Here you can see the original title of the work, Fantasia Symphonica number 1, and later Sibelius changed the title. He wanted it to be one of his numbered symphonies.
It's quite wild writing, isn't it?
Yes.
Angry.
Yes, and of course he was, as usual, in haste when writing this score.
Now, what's intriguing about this is its length. It's short. And one movement.
He was very consciously trying to find a new kind of symphonic form, and the 7th Symphony is, of course, the final product of this development.
The progress through the 7 symphonies is a very clear line to me. For him, the compositional process was paring back, paring down. The beauty of the 7th Symphony is in this crystallization. His processes are not like those of Beethoven and Brahms. Sibelius's way is to make things organically develop all the time. It goes from one mood, it might be a light-hearted, vivacious gaiety, and he builds it up and up into something more epic and more austere, perhaps, grander. And his ability to do that was second to none.
Despite its organic sound, writing music was often a struggle for Sibelius. He had periods of depression and a fondness for cigars and drink. He called alcohol his most faithful companion. That is, alongside his wife, Aino, who persuaded him to move to this more isolated life in the country.
They were married over 65 years. And Sibelius said that without Aino, I couldn't make any of my symphonies. Aino was a supporter and understanding.
So this is the famous portrait of Sibelius by Galen
Yes.
Beautifully dressed.
Yes, he was always very well dressed. But the hair.
The hair. He never combed his hair.
Mess.
How old was he here about?
30.
He was good looking.
Yes, he was very handsome. He had extremely blue eyes.
Piercing eyes.
Yes.
After finishing his Seventh Symphony in 1924, Sibelius lived another 30 years, but never completed another symphony. He worked for years on an eighth, promising it to Koussevitzky and the Boston Symphony Orchestra, but it was never finished. He destroyed the manuscript before anyone could hear it.
So he burnt his Eighth Symphony,
yes,
the manuscript, in this stove in 1945.
Yes. He was very, very depressed with his Eighth Symphony. People was waiting, always...
expectation for it.
Yes, because after the burning it and destroying, he was very happy and relaxed.
It's odd, it still feels warm.
Yes, Sibelius is still at home. Sibelius can step in from the garden.
A scary idea.
Yes.
I would say that the symphonies are in a way timeless. They continue the classic romantic symphonic tradition without being conservative, and they look ahead without being modernist.
It's impossible to know whether it was because of his acute self-criticism, whether he came to feel outside the mainstream of 20th century symphonic music, or whether he simply wanted to take it easy in his sauna. But for whatever reason, Sibelius' Seventh Symphony represents a kind of conclusion, and for the remaining 30 years of his life, he effectively lapsed into silence. But by the time the Seventh Symphony had been completed, new technological developments meant that symphonic music would be heard by far more people than ever before. The first revolution was the gramophone, introduced around the turn of the century, which meant that recorded music could be consumed at home. But the recording process wasn't well suited to orchestral music. This is the first recording of Beethoven's Fifth, made in Berlin in 1910. For symphonic music, the real revolution came in 1925 with the introduction of the electric microphone. A wider range of instruments could now be recorded, and in larger groups. This is Richard Strauss conducting Beethoven's Fifth in 1928. Decent orchestral recordings could now be made for the first time.
You all ready? Right.
Sir Edward Elgar inaugurating the new Abbey Road recording studios in 1931. A veteran composer ushering in a new age. Although he was conservative in his compositions, Elgar was forward-looking in one way. He was the first great composer to record his own symphonies. Although he was in his 70s and hadn't written anything significant for a decade, he made a determined effort to create a recorded legacy of his work, much of it done here in the new Abbey Road studios. He made the first recording of his Second Symphony in 1927. Elgar's Second Symphony had been written back in 1911, and while he was writing it, King Edward VII died. As the master of the king's music, Elgar dedicated the symphony to his memory with the heavy tread of its stately funeral march.
Behind the pomp of that formidable moustache and the circumstance of being the master of the king's music, there was a very shy, introverted, insecure man. Now, in the Second Symphony, we see a man pouring out his heart in a way that he, as a man in society, found very difficult to do. The work is dedicated to the memory of the king who died while he was writing the piece. But the truth is that this slow movement, which is such a great epitaph, is not a movement of national mourning, because it had already been written before the king died. It was his personal epitaph for a very surprising death of a very dear friend. His name was Rodewald, a man who had supported him before he was at all known and really believed in him and really gave him confidence. The main melody is, of course, the melody of a funeral march, and it has the trudge of a funeral march. But over and above the tune, you hear the oboe, completely free, keening for this lost friendship. And that's so bold and unmistakable. And when the orchestra cries out, screams out about that loss, it's one of the most moving things that I think exist in our nation's musical life.
The arrival of electric recording in the 1920s meant the rapid growth of the recording industry and broadcasting, which began around the same time. Symphonies were no longer confined to the concert hall, but could now be heard by millions. The BBC Symphony Orchestra, which plays the music for this film, was founded in 1930. And these developments in the musical world led also to the rise of conductors as transmitters of music to a much wider world, and as Elgar was quick to recognise, to the establishing of a musical canon, old as opposed to new music. These great works of the past took on more and more weight as superstar conductors travelled the world with a vast symphonic repertoire at the tip of their batons. Bruno Walter was a protégé of Mahler's, and it was he who'd conducted the premiere of his 9th Symphony in Vienna. He also conducted the Berlin premiere of Shostakovich's 1st Symphony. Leopold Stokowski was born in Britain, but made his name in the US. And the Italian Arturo Toscanini was described by Mussolini as the greatest conductor in the world. But Toscanini was no supporter of Mussolini, and he went to America in 1939. One of the biggest conducting stars of the time was Wilhelm Furtwängler, seen here conducting for Hitler's birthday in 1942. Hitler wasn't present, but Goebbels, the Nazis' propaganda minister, was, and made a point of congratulating Furtwängler at the end. As conductors got caught up in the politics of the time, composers too were conscripted. The outbreak of World War II increased the pressure on composers to make public statements with their work. The symphony inevitably became a propaganda tool. Never was this a more urgent requirement than during one of the most painful periods of Russian history, the siege of Leningrad, which is commemorated here in this museum. The city was blockaded by Nazi forces for 2.5 years, 872 days. A third of the population died from enemy bombardment, cold, and starvation. People received information from the radio, of course, which, in this city of musicians, was reduced to broadcasting the sound of a ticking metronome to reassure people that, despite everything, Leningrad was still alive. Shostakovich, in the besieged city, was composing and also working as a fireman. It was under these extraordinary circumstances that Shostakovich wrote his Leningrad Symphony, which was performed here in the city in August 1942. Propaganda aside, it was an act of heroism, with an orchestra assembled by bringing musicians back from the front line, granted extra rations, and the music defiantly relayed on speakers in the street.
And into that world tiptoes this distant, strange little drum. Taking my cue from Mravinsky, Shostakovich's favorite conductor, it's a side drum without snares. Not the sound of a military drum. It's easier for it to be very quiet if it's played without the snare. And it sounds more ominous and ghostly. And on top of this endlessly repeating little drum, the orchestra one by one join in and play this silly little tune.
Мы видим сканированные копии эскизов 7-й симфонии. Чрезвычайно интересно ремарки, выписанные рукой Шостаковича, поскольку издание симфонии перед ее премьерой быть не могло еще. Дирижер дирижировал по партитуре. Шостакович присутствовал на репетиции и следил по своим черновым эскизам. Шостаковичу явно не понравилось в первой части вот это место. Он сказал, стало громковато и грубовато. Фактура кларнета. Да, играть нежнее, здесь играть чуть тише.
This silly little tune goes on and gets nearer and changes from being trivial into something so threatening and overpowering and vulgar and hard that one wonders who is being referred to. At the climax of this march, not content with his large orchestra, he adds 10 extra brass players, just to roar, to scream in repetition, in fierce, uncompromising violence.
Unusually, Shostakovich wrote a program note for this symphony, saying he didn't want to write battle music, but to depict the ominous force of war. Nevertheless, debate is raised whether the unstoppable march represents the Nazi invader or an evil closer to home.
Это символ победы, борьбы со злом, будь то борьба человека со злом внутри себя, или борьба человека со злом внутри своего государства, или борьба человека со злом извне.
throughout his life, however weak he was physically. His will to compose what he wanted to compose never left him. And on the one hand, he had to speak to his people and make sure that he said something that they would be moved by. But on the other hand, he had to do it without offending too much the apparatchiks, the KGB, the Cultural Bureau that surrounded them all. When people would ask him, what's it about? We didn't quite understand. He would say, oh, just listen, you'll hear it. Or, for those who can hear, I think it's clear.
Whatever Shostakovich's intention, the Leningrad Symphony had an astonishing impact, and not just in Russia. As war raged on, the Soviets microfilmed the score and sent it via Tehran and an American naval ship to the US, their ally. It was conducted by Toscanini at Radio City in New York, the first of 60 performances in America in 1942. It was just the sort of public gesture the Allies wanted. This is a presentation for soldiers at a desert air base in California.
Guest of honor is Madame Ivy Litvinov, wife of the Russian ambassador to the United States.
I understand that you give me this wonderful welcome because you greet the brave and gallant men and women and soldiers of the Red Army in the Soviet Union.
Also on hand is Edward G. Robinson.
Now this music was written by a soldier, a Russian soldier, one who fought the siege of Leningrad. And Dmitri Shostakovich is still in it.
Праздником Великой Победы! Ура!
This is the annual Veterans Parade along Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg, when people gather to remember and celebrate the heroism and sacrifice of those who died in the Second World War.
Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony ended, of course, with a triumphant finale, depicting the victory of the people of Russia in the Great Patriotic War. As at no time before, I realized the public significance of my work, wrote Shostakovich, and my work was not in vain. The music helped the struggle for justice. In the US, America's leading composer Aaron Copland had been impressed by the mass appeal of the Leningrad Symphony and wrote a symphony of his own to celebrate the Allied victory. Copland's Third Symphony incorporates his fanfare for the common man, which had been commissioned when America first became involved in the war.
So here is the first page of Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man. Even if you can't read music, you see there aren't very many notes on the page at all. And the thing that I love about it is this real juxtaposition, kind of magic between the austerity on the one hand and the magnificence of the music.
Why the title? Why Fanfare for the Common Man?
Fanfare for the Common Man is so reflective of his innate egalitarianism. He really felt that it was the foot soldiers that were going to be carrying the burden of the war.
This is the house just outside New York that Copland bought in 1960 and where he spent the last 30 years of his life. He was a man who lived very frugally, and he spent much of his life moving from apartment to apartment back in the big city. But he was also someone who appreciated the serenity, isolation and the closeness to nature that he found here.
As comfortable as this house is, it's very unassuming and unpretentious. It's completely unostentatious. It has certain modernist touches, kind of frugal, simple, practical. We have his work desk off to the side, which is just wide plank barnwood made by a local farmer. And that's where Copland worked. He was looking for simplicity and practicality, and I think this was it.
Copland's Third Symphony has become the most performed of all American symphonies. Perhaps because, like his ballets Appalachian Spring and Rodeo, it has a distinctly American sound.
It's something that Copland really started out to do quite intentionally back in the mid-1920s when he felt that there was no such thing as a recognizably American musical idiom. There is something very open and spare about his textures. His chords seem to have a lot of air in them, which does convey something of the size and scope of the country.
I often feel that last movement is really about not just the landscape, though, but what you build on the landscape. You know, it's like building a frontier town. It's like Once Upon a Time in the West. It's what you build on the landscape that matters. And it's also about democracy. It's the old Dvorak idea of bringing the symphony to the common man. So it's not for nothing that this fanfare, which has this ruggedness about it, should be built into the last movement.
He translated this notion of egalitarianism into his art by consciously trying to reach a wider audience with works that might be more popular on the one hand, more accessible on the one hand, but on the other would still allow him to do the kinds of things he wanted to do artistically.
This is the monument to the defenders of Leningrad in Victory Square in St. Petersburg.
Of course, it was in Soviet Russia that a big Victory Symphony was expected, indeed required. Many people awaited Shostakovich's Ninth Symphony with eager anticipation, and with the fearsome precedent of Beethoven's Ninth in their minds, they must have been looking for something equally groundbreaking and heroic.
But Shostakovich's Ninth Symphony wasn't what the authorities wanted at all.
где торжественные фанфары, где триумфальный победный финал. Дело в том, что от него ждали триумфальную симфонию. Он хотел ее написать. Он ее начал сочинять. Некоторое время назад мне удалось найти саму партитуру, автограф Шостаковича. Эскизы и готовый фрагмент партитуры, которые исключали всякие сомнения в том, что да, Шостакович писал самая настоящая 9-я симфония, которую от него ждали. Он планировал первоначально ввести в нее и хор, но справедливо заметил: я буду заподозрен в нескромных аналогиях. 9-я симфония Бетховена.
It was part of Shostakovich's personality, I get the feeling, that he was a clown for his people, or that he was the person who could open up truths, like the fool in King Lear, that he saw himself, in a way, crying and joking at the same time. Now, the bassoon is the instrument better than any other that can express satire and pathos. No other wind instrument, particularly, has that ability to change so quickly. Now, what this says or speaks, I can't possibly say, but I know that it is keening, it is crying out. And when this has been exhausted and said, there's a moment of suspension, and we suddenly start the last movement. It's in a completely different mood, a completely different tempo, as if to say, I was only joking. Actually, everything's fine. And the sardonic, ironic character of the bassoon little tune, which seems so trivial and so like trying to banish all the tragedy that we've just shared, is very remarkable.
And of course, it's nothing like the spectacular, grandiose finale of Beethoven's Ninth.
He did something quite different, which was to really go back to Haydn. He wanted to write something that's seemingly light-hearted, but really very tragic underneath.
And what was he trying to say both to his audience and to the authorities, really?
I think it's in a way a goodbye to the great musical symphonic tradition in Germany, and the feeling that this has now come to an end.
At the end of the Second World War, Germany, the country which had seen itself as the guardian of the symphonic tradition, was in ruins. And here was Shostakovich, looking back at it in a sardonic farewell. Certainly the war is virtually the last event that seems to have demanded a symphonic response.
It was here in the heart of the old imperial city of Vienna that the notion of a cycle of symphonies, often ending with that fateful number 9, was born. But after the Second World War, Vienna, like Berlin, was divided into 4 zones of military occupation. This is a memorial in the city to the Red Army, and this perhaps foreshadows the subsequent democratization of music and its diversification into many new forms.
Over 250 years, we've made an incredible journey from small groups of musicians in the palaces of princes to orchestras more than 100 strong, and through works that are both personal and public. And the symphony has become to music what Shakespeare is to literature, a cultural monument that is continually redeveloped through new interpretations.
It still has the power to enchant, challenge, move me, and in the 21st century, a larger and wider audience than ever before.
go deeper into the music and unravel the secrets of the symphony, follow the links to the Open University at bbc.co.uk/symphony.
And you can hear every symphony from the series on BBC Radio 2, weekday afternoons at 2 o'clock. Next this evening here on BBC HD, we're back among the chimps of the Lost Gorge.